Long before the intricate glasswork of the chemist's vial, long before the sterilized white silence of the modern hospital or the frantic desperation of the street corner, there was only the earth, the sun, and the flower. To understand the story of the poppy, one must first strip away the noise of the present day. Forget the wars fought in its name, forget the empires that crumbled under its weight, and forget the stigma that now clings to its resin like a dark stain. Instead, cast your mind back to a time of primordial silence, a time when humanity was just beginning to scratch the surface of the world to see what lay beneath. Picture, if you will, the Fertile Crescent of ancient Mesopotamia, a land cradled by the great rivers Tigris and Euphrates, where the sun did not merely shine, but baked the very clay of history into permanence. It is here, under the watchful, unblinking gaze of forgotten gods and constellations that have since shifted in the sky, that the papaver somnifera first rose from the dust. It was a delicate thing, a paradox of nature. Visually, it possessed an ephemeral beauty, a papery chalice of vibrant red, sometimes ghost white, or a deep, bruising purple, swaying gently in the hot, dry breeze that swept down from the Zagros Mountains. It looked fragile, as if a heavy rain might shatter it, yet within its veins ran a chemical power strong enough to topple kings and subdue the agonizing screams of the dying. To the ancient Sumerians, the black-headed people who built the first great cities of Ur and Uruk, this flower was not a harbinger of doom. It was not a villain. It was a gift from the soil itself, a mercy granted by a harsh earth. They called it Hul Gil, the joy plant. But to understand why they named it joy, one must understand the misery of the ancient world. Life in the Neolithic and early Bronze Age was a brutal, visceral experience. It was a life of unremitting labor, where the body was the primary tool, constantly worn down by the friction of survival. Men and women broke their backs tilling the alluvial mud. They shattered their teeth on grit-filled bread. They suffered infections and injuries for which there was no cure but time or death. Pain was not an interruption of life. It was the background noise of existence. It was the constant companion of the laborer, the soldier, and the mother. Into this world of sharp edges and aching bones, the poppy emerged as the soft, enveloping silence. Imagine the scene. 4,000, perhaps 5,000 years ago. The landscape is vast, flat, and beige, broken only by the grid of irrigation canals and the rising ziggurats that sought to touch the heavens. It is early summer. The heat is beginning to rise, a shimmering haze that distorts the horizon. A farmer, his skin weathered to the texture of old leather by years of exposure, walks through a field that is not filled with wheat or barley, but with the nodding heads of the poppy. He is not a drug lord. He is a cultivator of medicine, a man performing a ritual as sacred as the harvest of grain. He holds in his hand a small tool, perhaps a shard of sharp flint, or a blade of obsidian, black and jagged. He approaches the flower. The petals have already fallen away, leaving behind the bulbous, green seed pod, the capsule of the plant's soul. The farmer knows the timing must be precise. If he strikes too early, the milk is weak; too late, and the resin dries inside the husk. He waits for the twilight, or perhaps the very first gray light of dawn, when the air is still and the heat has not yet evaporated the plant's essence. With a steady, practiced hand, he scores the skin of the pod. He does not cut deep enough to pierce the inner wall, for that would kill the seed. He makes a shallow, vertical incision, a mere scratch on the surface of the green globe. And then, the magic happens. It is a slow, chemical weeping. From the wound, a milky white substance begins to bleed out. It is thick, opaque, and bitter. This is the latex, the lifeblood of the poppy. As it meets the air, a transformation occurs, a natural alchemy fueled by the oxygen and the sun. The white milk begins to darken, turning a rusty brown. And finally, a deep, sticky black. This is the raw opium. This is the mother of all that would follow, the chaotic soup of alkaloids, morphine, codeine, the bane, locked together in a molecular embrace, waiting to be consumed. The farmer moves down the row, scoring pod after pod, leaving them to bleed. He will return later, perhaps the next morning, to scrape the sticky gum from the pods with a curved iron or wooden spatula, gathering the dark resin into clay jars. The smell of the field is heavy, distinct. It is not the sweet perfume of a rose, but an earthy, musk-like scent, the smell of deep vegetation and raw chemistry. It is a scent that promises weight. In this era, the substance was viewed as a bridge. It was a bridge between the waking world, with its relentless demands and sharp pains, and the divine silence of sleep. The Sumerians, and later the Babylonians and Assyrians, did not distinguish between medicine magic, and religion. A fever was a demon. A cure was an exorcism. The poppy was the weapon against the demon of pain. It was used to quiet a crying child. A common and desperate application in a world where infant mortality was high, and the cries of a sick baby could pierce the soul of a household. A small dab of the raw resin, perhaps dissolved in wine or honey, would be rubbed on the gums, or given to the child to swallow. The crying would cease. The breathing would slow. The child would drift into a slumber that looked like peace. It was used to ease the passing of the dying. Death in the ancient world was often slow and agonizing, the result of gangrene, tetanus, or internal maladies that the physicians of the time, the Asu and the Ashapu, could not diagnose, let alone cure. When the incantations failed, when the prayers to Marduk or Ishtar went unanswered, there was the poppy. It was the final mercy. To administer the whole gill was to grant the sufferer a release from the cage of their own nervous system. It washed away the fear and the agony, replacing it with a warm, floating detachment, a twilight state where the spirit seemed to loosen its grip on the body, making the final transition into the underworld less of a struggle and more of a surrender. And it was used to commune with the spirits. The priests and mystics, seeking to step outside the boundaries of the mundane, would consume the resin to induce visions or trance states. In the cool, dark recesses of the temples, amidst the smoke of incense and the chanting of hymns, the poppy provided a key to a door that remained locked to the sober mind. It blurred the edges of reality. It softened the harsh lines of the material world, allowing the user to feel closer to the ethereal, to the gods who dwelt in the stars and the mountains. There was no stigma yet. There were no laws prohibiting its use, no moral crusade against the flower. It was simply a part of the landscape, as natural as the date palm or the olive tree. The poppy fields stretched toward the horizon, a sea of potential sleep swaying in the Mesopotamian wind. It was a commodity, yes, but it was also a sacrament. It was traded in clay jugs, carried by donkeys and riverboats down the Euphrates, exchanged for silver, lapis lazuli, and cedar wood. The knowledge of its power spread slowly, not with the speed of the internet, but with the steady, plodding pace of the caravan. From the fertile mud of Sumer, the knowledge passed to the Babylonians, who inherited the cities and the gods of their predecessors. They, too, revered the plant. They understood its dual nature, though they perhaps did not have the language of modern pharmacology to describe it. They knew that in small doses, it was the hand of the healer, capable of stopping dysentery, suppressing coughs, and dulling the ache of a broken bone. But they also knew that in large doses, it was the hand of death, a poison that could stop the breath forever. This duality is the central theme of the poppy's history. It is both the savior and the destroyer, the medicine and the poison. Heaven and hell contained within a single drop of dried latex. As centuries turned into millennia, the use of the poppy seeped out of Mesopotamia, flowing like water into the surrounding civilizations. It traveled west to the Nile Valley, finding a new home in the dark, rich soil of Egypt. The ancient Egyptians, obsessed with the preservation of the body and the journey of the soul, embraced the poppy. We find evidence of it in their medical papyri, listed as a cure for crying children and a remedy for headaches. They crafted small vessels, known today as Cypriot juglets, shaped like the inverted poppy pod itself, designed to hold the precious opium dissolved in liquid. These juglets have been found in tombs and ruins across the Levant, a testament to a thriving Bronze Age drug trade. Imagine the Egyptian physician, a man of shaved head and linen robes, mixing the opium with fly dung and wine, a common prescription to soothe a restless pharaoh or a high priest. The specific recipe mattered less than the active ingredient. The opium worked. It worked with a consistency that few other ancient remedies could claim. If you had a crushed leg from a chariot accident, willow bark might take the edge off. But opium obliterated the reality of the injury. It created a distance between the man and his pain. It allowed the ancient mind, so often besieged by the terrifying uncontrollability of nature, a moment of absolute, chemically induced control. But let us pause and consider the internal experience of the ancient user. Without the context of addiction as a disease, without the modern narrative of the junkie, what was the experience of the Hulgil? It was likely viewed as a spiritual intervention. When the heavy, warm sensation spread through the limbs, when the anxiety of the drought or the harvest or the war faded away, it must have felt like the physical touch of a god. It was a feeling of being held. In a world that was often indifferent to human suffering, the poppy offered a tangible, consumable form of love. It was a chemical embrace. However, the shadow was always there. Even in the ancient texts, there are hints of the danger. The sleep of the poppy was known to be deep, sometimes too deep. There were those who took too much and never woke up, their spirits slipping away into the great below without a sound. And there were surely those who found that they could not live without it, who found the waking world too gray, too sharp, too painful after the golden embrace of the resin. The dependency was not chronicled with the clinical precision of modern science, but the human brain has not changed in 5,000 years. The receptors that bind to morphine today are the same receptors that bound to it in the shadow of the ziggurat of Ur. The cycle of tolerance and withdrawal, the subtle rewiring of the reward pathways, would have occurred in the Sumerian farmer just as it occurs in the modern addict. The difference was the narrative. To them, it was not a pathology. It was a hunger for the divine peace. As the Bronze Age collapsed and gave way to the Iron Age, the poppy endured. Empires fell. The great cities of Mesopotamia were sacked, burned, and abandoned to the shifting sands. The language of Sumer died out, becoming a scholar's tongue, known only to the scribes. But the Papaver somniferum did not die. It is a hardy plant. It requires little water. It thrives in poor soil. It is a survivor. It followed humanity out of the cradle of civilization, carried in pouches and clay jars, spreading into Persia, into India, into the Greco-Roman world. The Greeks, with their love of categorization and philosophy, took the poppy and wove it into their mythology. They associated it with Hypnos, the god of sleep, and Morpheus, the god of dreams. They understood the profound link between the plant and the subconscious. In their art, you will see deities crowned with poppy wreaths, or holding the pods in their hands as they bestow rest upon the weary heroes of the Iliad and the Odyssey. Homer speaks of nepenthe, a drug of forgetfulness, which many scholars believe was opium. In the Odyssey, Helen of Troy cast nepenthe into the wine to banish pain and anger and all painful memories. Here, the function of the plant shifts slightly in the cultural consciousness. It is no longer just a painkiller for the body, it is a painkiller for the soul. It is a cure for memory. In a world ravaged by the Trojan War, by loss and grief, the desire to forget was a powerful force. The poppy offered oblivion. It offered a temporary suicide of the memory, a way to erase the trauma of the sword and the spear. It is a poignant image. The great warriors and queens of antiquity, clad in bronze and purple, seeking refuge not in conquest, but in the small dark seed of a flower. Let us return to the image of the seed itself. It is minuscule, almost dust-like. One pod contains thousands of seeds. It is a metaphor for the proliferation of the substance. From that single point of origin in the Fertile Crescent, the seeds were scattered by the winds of trade and war. They found purchase in the mountains of Afghanistan, in the valleys of India, in the Golden Triangle of Southeast Asia. But the root, the spiritual ancestor of every poppy field that exists today, lies in that ancient Sumerian mud. The method of extraction, too, remained remarkably unchanged for thousands of years. From the Neolithic period until the industrial processing of the 19th century, the technology was exactly the same. The scoring of the pod, the weighting, the scraping, the human hand touching the plant. It was an intimate, tactile relationship. There were no factories, no synthetic derivatives, no needles. There was only the sun, the earth, the plant, and the human desire for relief. As we drift through this history, watching the smoke of the opium lamps rise through the centuries, we must acknowledge the profound silence that surrounds the poppy's early days. The ancient world was a quiet place compared to ours. No engines, no electricity, no digital hum. The silence of the desert night was absolute. In that silence, the effect of the opium must have been thunderous. It amplified the internal world. It turned the mind into a vast, echoing cavern of dreams. For the mystic in the temple, the drug was a telescope, allowing him to see into the realm of the gods. For the dying man, it was a ship, carrying him gently across the dark waters of death. And what of the social fabric? In ancient Sumer, society was rigid, hierarchical, built on the absolute authority of the king and the temple. Order was paramount. Chaos was the enemy. The poppy, curiously, served the order. By mitigating pain, by soothing the populace, by offering a release valve for the suffering of the masses, it likely helped to stabilize these early civilizations. A population that is in agony is a population that riots. A population that can sleep, that can dull the ache of the lash or the plow, is a population that endures. In this sense, the whole gill was a pillar of the state, a silent partner in the project of civilization. But let us not romanticize it entirely. There is a darkness in the poppy that is ancient and cold. The Sumerians, in their wisdom, perhaps sensed this. The very name, whole gill, while translated as joy plant, carries with it the complexity of their language. Joy in the ancient world was not the shallow happiness of a modern advertisement. Joy was relief. Joy was the cessation of suffering. And the ultimate cessation of suffering is death. The poppy sat on that razor's edge. It was the bringer of sleep, and sleep is the brother of death. Visualizing the landscape again, we can see the seasons change over the Fertile Crescent. The floods come, depositing the silt. The crops are sown, the sun hardens the ground. The poppy blooms, a splash of blood red against the brown earth. It is a cycle that repeats for millennia. The empires change. Sumer gives way to Akkad to Babylon, Babylon to the Persians to the Greeks. The languages change. The gods change. Enlil becomes Marduk, Marduk becomes Ahura, Mazda, then Zeus. But the flower remains the same. Its chemistry is eternal. The alkaloid profile of a poppy harvested by a Sumerian priest in 3000 BC is identical to the profile of a poppy harvested today. It is a constant in the human story, a biological anchor that connects us to our ancestors. When we think of history, we often think of stone, the pyramids, the statues, the walls of great cities. We think of things that endure through hardness. But the history of the poppy teaches us that there is power in softness. The flower is ephemeral. It wilts in a day. The resin is soft. It melts in the heat. Yet this soft, fleeting thing has outlasted the stone. The ziggurat of Ur is a ruin, a mound of eroded brick in the Iraqi desert. The Code of Hammurabi is a museum piece. But the poppy? The poppy is more alive today than ever. It has conquered the world in a way that Alexander the Great never could. It has woven itself into the biochemistry of the human species. The transition from the ancient use to the modern crisis was a slow burn. It was a journey from the temple to the laboratory, from the sacred to the profane. But in those early days, in the glow of the oil lamps of Babylon, it was still innocent. It was still the joy plant. It was the answer to the riddle of pain. Consider the physician Galen, writing centuries later in the Roman Empire, but drawing on this ancient knowledge. He described opium as the strongest of the drugs, which numb the senses and induce sleep. He was looking back at a tradition that was already ancient in his time. He was standing on the shoulders of those nameless Sumerian farmers who first dared to taste the bitter milk. The continuity of knowledge is staggering. From the clay tablet, to the papyrus scroll, to the parchment codex, the recipe was passed down. Take the tears of the poppy. And so, the seeds were sown not just in the earth, but in the human consciousness. The desire for an altered state, for a reprieve from the burden of consciousness, is as old as consciousness itself. The Sumerians, with their stark, pessimistic view of the universe, a universe where the gods were capricious, and the afterlife was a grim, dusty cavern, needed the poppy. They needed the whole gill to soften the edges of their reality. It was a coping mechanism for the human condition. As the sun sets over the ancient Euphrates in our mind's eye, we see the silhouette of the ziggurat against the purple sky. The air cools. The sounds of the city, the bleating of goats, the grinding of grain, the voices of the people begin to fade. The lamps are lit. In the homes of the rich and the poor alike, the resin is prepared. It is a ritual of evening. It is the seeking of the dreamless and eternal rest. The story of the poppy is the story of our desire to escape pain. It is a story that begins in the mud of Mesopotamia, but it does not end there. It is a river of white milk that flows through history, turning into a river of smoke, and finally, a river of white powder. But here, at the beginning, it is just a flower swaying in the wind, under the gaze of forgotten gods, a flower that holds the keys to heaven and hell in its delicate, papery grip. The ancient world did not know what it had unleashed. They saw only the gift. They did not see the hook hidden within the bait. They saw the joy. They did not see the sorrow that would follow in its wake, centuries later. But perhaps, even if they had known, they would have used it anyway. For pain is a tyrant, and the poppy is the only rebel that can overthrow it, if only for a few hours. And so, the resin dried in the sun. The tablets were baked. The history was written not just in cuneiform, but in the receptors of the brain. The Papaver somniferum took its place in the pantheon of powers that rule the human life, sitting quietly beside fire, beside wheat, beside iron. A quiet power, a silent conqueror. The flower of sleep, blooming in the cradle of civilization, waiting for the world to wake up and take a bite. Time flows like a river, relentless and indifferent, carrying the debris of history and the secrets of the earth across the spine of the world. Just as the great rivers of the Tigris and the Euphrates once cradled the birth of the poppy, the river of time carried its resin away from the cradle, pushing it outward, into the vast, unknowable expanse of the developing human story. The flower did not stay in the garden of the Sumerians. It was too potent, too useful, and too dangerous to remain a local secret. It possessed a momentum of its own, a silent botanical conquest that moved at the speed of the camel and the caravan. Picture the Silk Road, that legendary ribbon of trade that stitched the East to the West. It was a treacherous, magnificent artery of civilization, winding through the high, freezing passes of the Pamir Mountains and across the blistering, sun-bleached dunes of the Taklamakan Desert. Here, amidst the jingle of brass bells and the slow, rhythmic plodding of beasts of burden, the poppy traveled. It was tucked into the saddlebags of merchants who spoke a dozen different tongues: Sogdians, Persians, Bactrians. It sat alongside bolts of shimmering silk, jars of aromatic spices, and precious stones. But unlike the silk, which was for the eye, or the spice, which was for the tongue, the dark, sticky balls of opium were for the spirit. For centuries, as empires rose and fell like tides in a celestial ocean, the knowledge of the poppy was safeguarded and disseminated by the Arab traders and physicians of the Islamic Golden Age. While Europe slumbered in the gray mist of the Dark Ages, the scholars of Baghdad and Damascus were reading the ancient Greek texts, refining the medical wisdom of Galen and Dioscorides. They understood the dual nature of the substance. They called it aphion, a word that rolled off the tongue with a heavy, lidded sound. They knew it was the destroyer of grief, but they also wrote of its dangers, of the lethargy that could consume a man who loved the pipe too much. Yet, the resin moved on. It crossed the Mediterranean, carried by the lateen-rigged ships that cut through the blue waters, bringing the goods of the Orient to the hungry markets of Venice and Genoa. It filtered into the apothecaries of Renaissance Europe, a mysterious, expensive ingredient known only to the learned. It was here, in the candlelit laboratories of the 16th century, that a figure of immense importance steps out of the shadows: Paracelsus, a man of wild hair and wilder ideas, an alchemist who walked a line between science and sorcery. He believed that nature held the key to immortality, if only it could be unlocked. He took the raw opium, the black gum of the ancients, and he did something revolutionary. He dissolved it in alcohol. In doing so, he created a tincture, a golden brown liquid that was easier to measure, easier to store, and far faster to act upon the blood. He named it laudanum, from the Latin laudare, meaning to praise. Indeed, for the next 300 years, physicians would praise it. They would call it the stone of immortality. They believed they had distilled the essence of relief itself. Paracelsus carried this secret in the pommel of his sword, a hidden reservoir of the arcanum, the secret remedy that he claimed could wake the dead, or at least bring the suffering back from the brink of the abyss. But time flows on, and the world began to change. The rhythmic, organic pace of the ancient world gave way to the mechanical, grinding gears of the modern era. The age of the sail surrendered to the age of steam. The wooden hulls of merchant ships grew larger, their bellies filled not just with luxury goods, but with the raw fuel of empire. By the time the 19th century dawned, the world was being redrawn by the smokestack and the railway. And the poppy, adaptable as ever, found its place in this new, soot-stained world. We arrive now in the misty, gas-lit streets of Victorian England. It is a world of stark contrasts. On one side, the immense wealth of an empire upon which the sun never set. On the other, the crushing, grinding poverty of the industrial slums. The air is thick with yellow fog, a soup of coal smoke and river damp that clings to the wool coats of the passers-by. The cobblestones glisten with rain. In this atmosphere, opium ceased to be a mystical exoticism of the East. It became a mundane, terrifyingly common commodity of the West. It had settled everywhere. It was in the drawing rooms of the literary elite, where velvet curtains shut out the noise of the street, and a fire crackled in the hearth. Here, the romantic poets and writers sought to expand their consciousness, to break the shackles of the rational mind that the Industrial Revolution had forged. Men like Thomas de Quincey and Samuel Taylor Coleridge did not hide their use, they celebrated it. To them, the laudanum bottle was a muse. It was a key to a landscape of Kubla Khan, a world of impossible palaces and sunless seas. De Quincey, in his famous Confessions of an English Opium Eater, described the experience not as a vice, but as a celestial journey. He wrote of the abyss of divine enjoyment that opened up after a glass of the ruby-colored liquid. He painted the drug in the colors of the sublime. He described the feeling of perfect, crystalline peace, where the clamor of the world receded, leaving only a symphony of internal thought. This dark romanticism seduced a generation. It framed the drug as a tool for the intellectual, a necessary companion for the sensitive soul forced to exist in a harsh, mechanical world. But this was only the gilded surface. Beneath the poetry and the philosophy lay a reality that was far more pervasive and far less romantic. For the vast majority of the population, opium was not a muse. It was a tool for survival. Walk with me out of the drawing room and into the narrow, crowded streets of the East End of London, or the tenement blocks of Manchester and New York. Here, life was a brutal struggle against exhaustion, infection, and despair. There was no National Health Service, no antibiotics, no sick leave. If you did not work, you did not eat. If you coughed blood, you worked until you fell. In this world, laudanum was the aspirin of the era. It was the universal panacea. It sat on the bedside tables of grandmothers and housewives. It was sold in the grocer's shop, right next to the tea and the flour. There were no prescriptions, no warnings, no child-proof caps. It was cheaper than gin and cheaper than beer. It came under 100 different names, innocent-sounding proprietary blends that promised health and vitality. Godfrey's cordial, Mrs. Winslow's soothing syrup, Bateman's pectoral drops. The labels featured cherubic children and kindly nurses, images of safety and care. But inside the bottle was the ancient power of the poppy, dissolved in treacle and alcohol. It was used to treat everything. A toothache? Take the drops. A persistent cough? Take the drops. Nerves, hysteria, dysentery, rheumatism, fatigue? The answer was always the same. The amber liquid was poured onto a spoon and swallowed. And the result was always the same. The pain vanished, the coughing stopped, the bowels slowed, and a warm, heavy blanket of silence descended upon the sufferer. Consider the tragedy of the quietness. In the cramped, damp apartments of the working class, where women worked long hours sewing or washing, a crying baby was a threat to the family's survival. The mother, exhausted, desperate for sleep, needing to silence the child so she could work or rest, would reach for the soothing syrup. She would administer a spoonful to the infant, and the baby would sleep. They called them dozers. The tragedy was that many of these children, their small bodies overwhelmed by the narcotic, drifted from sleep into a coma, and from coma into death. It was a silent epidemic, buried under the statistics of failure to thrive or wasting away. The poppy, intended as a mercy, had become a thief of life in the cradle. Yet, the society of the 1800s was slow to condemn it. The medical establishment was still operating under the theories of the humors and the nervous system. They viewed pain as a pathological state that drained the vital force. Therefore, anything that stopped pain was preserving life. Opium was the anchor of life. It was the one drug that a doctor could rely on to actually do something. In a medical bag filled with leeches, mercury, and useless herbs, the opium bottle was the only thing that offered guaranteed relief. It was the physician's best friend and his darkest secret. But gradually, as the decades wore on, a shadow began to grow beneath the velvet comfort. The physicians, those men of science, with their starched collars and leather notebooks, began to notice a pattern. They noticed that the patients who took the drug for pain eventually took it for something else. They took it to feel normal. They took it to ward off a sickness that seemed to arise from the very absence of the drug. The body, in its infinite biological wisdom, had learned the chemistry of the flower. It had adjusted. It craved the silence the opium provided. When the drug was withdrawn, the silence was shattered by a roaring rebound of the nervous system. The opium appetite, they called it, or inebriety. They described the symptoms with a mixture of clinical detachment and horror. The yawning, the lacrimation, the restlessness that felt like insects crawling beneath the skin, the profound, crushing melancholy that made death seem preferable to another hour of sobriety. A duality emerged, sharper than ever before. There was the honeymoon phase, the period of relief and golden dreams. And then there was the slavery, the iron chain that bound the user to the bottle. The literary elite were not immune. De Quincey wrote of his ileal pains and the torments of withdrawal. Coleridge lamented the woeful impotence of the will. The drug that had been a bridge to the divine had become a prison cell. But the Victorian era was not an age of despair. It was an age of supreme, almost arrogant, optimism. This was the century of progress. Man had harnessed the power of steam to drive ships against the wind. He had sent messages through wires across the ocean floor. He had illuminated the night with gas. The scientific mind of the 1800s believed that there was no problem that could not be solved by intellect and industry. They looked at the poppy, and they did not see a curse. They saw a puzzle. They believed that nature was messy, impure, and chaotic. The raw opium gum was a soup of organic material, waxes, fats, sugars, and a dozen different alkaloids all mixed together. The scientists reasoned that the poisonous aspects of the drug, the addiction, the nausea, the lethargy, were due to these impurities. If they could only refine it, if they could strip away the crude plant matter and isolate the pure active principle, they could tame the beast. They could create a safe opium. They believed they could separate the blessing from the curse. And so, the chemists began their work. It started quietly, in the back room of a dusty apothecary shop in Paderborn, Germany. The year was 1804. A young apprentice named Friedrich Serturner was experimenting with the black gum. He was not a distinguished professor. He was a 20-year-old boy with a curious mind and a stubborn streak. He worked at night, by the light of a flickering candle, surrounded by glass retorts and beakers. He dissolved the opium in acid, then neutralized it with ammonia, filtering and precipitating the solution over and over again. He was looking for the soul of the plant. He was looking for the specific molecule that carried the god of sleep. Finally, after months of trial and error, he succeeded. He isolated a white, crystalline substance. It was bitter to the taste. It was pure. Unlike the dark, sticky gum of the ancients, this was clean, white, and mathematical in its precision. He tested it on local stray dogs, and then, bravely and perhaps foolishly, on himself and 3 friends. The result was a sleep so deep, a coma so profound, that they nearly died. He had found it. He had distilled the essence of the whole gill. He named the substance after Morpheus, the Greek god of dreams, the son of Hypnos, who shaped the visions of sleepers. He called it morphium. We know it today as morphine. It was a moment of triumph for science. For the first time in history, humanity had extracted an active alkaloid from a plant. It was the birth of modern pharmacology, but it was also a moment of profound irony. The scientists believed they had purified the medicine, that they had created a safer, more controllable tool. In reality, they had merely concentrated the power. They had taken a weapon that was equivalent to a club and turned it into a razor-sharp sword. Morphine was 10 times more potent than raw opium. The addiction it caused was faster, deeper, and harder to break. But the world did not know this yet. The discovery was hailed as a miracle. The white crystals were viewed as a triumph of man over nature. The hypodermic needle, invented shortly after, provided the perfect delivery system. No longer did the drug need to pass through the slow, inefficient digestive system. It could be injected directly into the blood, delivering immediate, godlike relief. We can imagine the scene in the mid-19th century hospitals: the Civil War in America, the Franco-Prussian War in Europe, the screams of the wounded, the shattered limbs, the dysentery. And then, the doctor arrives with the shining steel needle and the vial of clear liquid. The injection is given, and within seconds, the screaming stops. The soldier's face relaxes. The pain is gone. It seemed like magic. It seemed like mercy in its purest form. And yet, as the soldiers returned home, limping from the battlefields, they carried with them a new ghost. They called it the soldier's disease. It was a hunger that gnawed at their bones, a need that drove them to the pharmacist again and again. The cure had followed them home, but the chemists were not finished. The scientific hubris of the era was insatiable. If morphine was good, but still addictive, then surely the answer lay in further refinement. They believed they could engineer the addiction out of the molecule. They believed that if they just tweaked the chemical structure, if they added an acetyl group here, or boiled it with a different acid there, they would finally achieve the Holy Grail, a non-addictive painkiller. The laboratories of the late 19th century hummed with this quest. In London, in Frankfurt, in Paris, men in white coats stared into microscopes and swirled liquids in flasks. They were driven by a mix of altruism and capitalism. The pharmaceutical industry was being born. Companies like Merck and Bayer were rising, building vast factories to mass-produce these new miracle drugs. The air smelled of sulfur and ether. The glass tubes hissed with steam. They did not see themselves as peddlers of doom. They saw themselves as the architects of a pain-free world. They were the new priesthood, replacing the ancient shamans. Instead of a prayer and a raw pod, they offered a pill and a precise dosage. They were bringing order to the chaos of biology. But nature is not easily tamed. The poppy, with its millions of years of evolution, held its secrets tight. The chemical pathways that blocked pain were the very same pathways that triggered the reward system. The lock and the key were forged together. To numb the pain was to numb the soul. To wake the pleasure was to invite the demon of want. As the century drew to a close, the stage was set for the next great tragedy. The biography of the substance was about to take its darkest turn. The river of time was widening, moving faster, rushing toward a waterfall that no one could see. The optimism of the Victorian era, with its belief in progress and the perfectibility of man, was about to collide with the hard, cold reality of neurochemistry. We stand now at the precipice of the 20th century. The gaslights are flickering, soon to be replaced by the harsh glare of the electric bulb. The horse-drawn carriages are making way for the automobile. And in the laboratories of the Bayer Company in Germany, a chemist is looking at a bottle of morphine and wondering, what if What if we boil it with acetic anhydride? What if we modify it just one more time? He is about to create a substance that he will name heroin, because it makes the user feel heroic. He thinks he has found the cure for morphine addiction. He thinks he has found the perfect cough suppressant for children. He thinks he has won. But the poppy, ancient and silent, knows better. It has traveled from the clay tablets of Sumer to the sterile glass of the modern lab. It has changed its form from flower to gum, from gum to tincture, from tincture to crystal, but its essence remains unchanged. It is still the Hull Gill. It is still the joy and the sorrow, braided together in a double helix of destiny. The chemists wiped their hands on their aprons, satisfied with their day's work. They noted the melting points and the solubility ratios in their leather-bound journals. They went home to their families, unaware that they had just unlocked the door to a century of addiction. They had tried to outsmart the flower, but the flower was patient. The flower had time. And as the sun set on the 19th century, the shadow of the poppy grew longer than ever before, stretching out to cover the future in a blanket of white powder. The silence of the opium den was giving way to the roar of the narcotic trade. The dream was ending. The nightmare was about to begin. The wheel of history turned slowly, grinding the stone of the past into the dust of the present, and as the 19th century dawned, the world stood upon a precipice of profound transformation. The ancient ways, the rhythms of the harvest, and the superstitions of the village healer were beginning to fade into the gray mist of memory. In their place, a new light was rising, the cold, clear, unwavering light of science. It was an era where the mysteries of the universe were no longer accepted as divine riddles to be endured, but as locks, waiting to be picked by the iron keys of reason and experimentation. And nowhere was this shift more palpable, more intimate, and more dangerous than in the quiet, shadow-filled back rooms of the European apothecary. To understand the birth of the modern age of narcotics, we must transport ourselves to the year 1804. We must leave behind the sun-baked clay of Mesopotamia and the chaotic bazaars of the Silk Road, and travel to the damp, cobblestone streets of Paderborn, a small, unassuming city in what is now Germany. It is night. The town is sleeping under a heavy blanket of winter fog. The only light comes from the flickering gas lamps that cast long, dancing shadows against the timber-framed houses. But in one window, a light still burns. It is the window of the court pharmacy, a place of dried herbs, glass jars, and the pervasive, acrid smell of sulfur and vinegar. Inside, bent over a workbench crowded with retorts, funnels, and crucibles, is a young man. He is barely 20 years old. His name is Friedrich Serturner. He is not a distinguished professor with a white beard and a university chair. He is an apprentice, a liveried servant of science, lacking the pedigree of the elite. But within his mind burns a singular, consuming obsession that outshines the candle by which he works. He is haunted by the poppy. For millennia, physicians and healers had used raw opium. They knew it worked, but they did not know why. They knew that within the sticky, black gum of the plant lay a power to heal and a power to kill. But the dosage was a gamble. One batch of raw opium might be weak, offering no relief to the screaming patient. The next might be potent enough to stop the heart of a horse. It was a game of Russian roulette, played with nature. The scientific community of the time, entrenched in the old beliefs, held that plants were single, indivisible entities, that their virtues could not be separated from their physical form. Serturner believed otherwise. He believed that the plant was merely a vessel, a husk that contained a specific, isolate spirit. He believed that if he could strip away the plant matter, the waxes, the fats, the sugars, the inert debris of biology, he would find the active principle, the very soul of the poppy itself. Watch him now, in the silence of the laboratory. The only sound is the scratching of his quill pen and the bubbling of liquid in a glass flask. He takes the raw opium, that ancient substance of the Sumerians, and dissolves it in acid. He heats it, he watches the vapors rise. He neutralizes it with ammonia. It is a tedious, repetitive process, a chemical purification ritual performed night after night, while the rest of the world sleeps. He filters the solution, watching the liquid drip, drop by slow drop, into a clean beaker. And then, something miraculous happens. As the solution cools and settles, a change occurs. From the dark, murky liquid, something new begins to emerge. Tiny particles begin to fall like snow in a winter sky. They gather at the bottom of the glass, forming crystals. They are not black like the opium gum. They are yellowish, white, prismatic, glistening in the candlelight. They look innocent, almost like sugar or salt. But they are neither. Serturner has done the impossible. He has cracked the code of the plant kingdom. He has isolated the first alkaloid in human history. He has separated the chemical god from its botanical temple, but the young apprentice is a true scientist. He knows that isolation is not proof. He must test the power of these crystals. He cannot publish a theory based on visual beauty alone. And so, the story takes a turn into the dark cellar of the pharmacy. Sir Turner begins to experiment on the stray dogs and rats that haunt the alleyways of Paderborn. He mixes the crystals with food and watches. The reaction is terrifyingly swift. The animals do not just sleep. They fall into a stupor so deep it mimics death. Their breathing slows to a shallow rattle. Their limbs become heavy, pliable lead. Yet, this is not enough for Sir Turner. He must know the effect on the human mind. In a display of bravery, or perhaps the reckless hubris that often accompanies great discovery, he decides to become his own subject. He gathers 3 friends, fellow apprentices who share his curiosity and his disregard for safety. They retreat to the back room. Sir Turner measures out the crystals. A grain of the substance, a tiny amount, dissolved in alcohol. They raise their glasses. A toast to science. A toast to the unknown. They drink. At first, there is nothing. Then, a warmth. A flushing of the skin. And then, the world begins to tilt. The gravity of the room seems to increase, pulling them down into the chairs, down into the floor. The candle flame blurs into a halo of light. Pain, anxiety, the cold draft from the window, all of it dissolves. They enter a state of dreamlike suspension. But the dose is too high. The dream turns into a nightmare. Nausea grips them, violent and relentless. Their pulses hammer and then fade. They lie on the floor for hours, hovering on the thin gray line between a deep sleep and a final one. Only by the grace of youth, and perhaps a desperate intervention of induced vomiting, do they survive the night. When Sir Turner wakes, pale and shaking, he does not recoil in horror. He realizes what he has found. He has found the concentrated essence of sleep. He has found the key to the gate of dreams. He looks at the white crystals with a newfound reverence and fear. He needs a name for this child of his intellect. He turns to the classics, to the dusty books of Greek mythology that sit on the pharmacy shelf. He reads of Morpheus, the son of Hypnos, the god of sleep. Morpheus, the shaper of dreams, the winged deity who could assume any human form and appear in the slumber of kings and heroes. Morpheus, who brought quiet to the noisy mind. It is a fitting name, a poetic name. And so, he christens the substance morphium. We know it today as morphine. It took years for the world to listen. Sir Turner was young, obscure, and publishing in minor journals. But truth, like water, eventually finds its level. By 1817, the great French chemist Gay-Lussac noticed the work, and suddenly, the eyes of the scientific world turned to Paderborn. The discovery was hailed as a miracle. It was the magnum opus of pharmacology. For the first time, doctors could administer a precise dose. No more guessing with raw opium. 10 milligrams of morphine was 10 milligrams of morphine. In London, in Paris, or in New York. It was pure. It was consistent. It was the triumph of man over the chaos of nature. The medical world breathed a collective sigh of relief. They believed they finally had the perfect weapon against pain. Pain, that ancient enemy that had mocked physicians since the dawn of time, could now be silenced with mathematical precision. The crystals were manufactured, bottled, and sold. The dark idol of the Romantics had been scrubbed clean, dressed in the white coat of science, and placed on the pedestal of progress. But a weapon requires a delivery system, and in the middle of the 19th century, another invention would marry itself to morphine, creating a union of terrifying efficiency. In 1853, in Scotland and France almost simultaneously, 2 men, Alexander Wood and Charles Prevost, were tinkering with a new device. It was a simple concept, really. A hollow metal tube, sharpened to a fine point, attached to a glass cylinder and a plunger, the hypodermic syringe. Before this moment, medicine had to be swallowed, or rubbed on the skin. The body had natural defenses, the stomach acid, the skin barrier that filtered and slowed the absorption of any drug. The syringe bypassed the sentries. It broke the skin. It entered the fortress of the body directly. It allowed the doctor to inject the dissolved morphine straight into the bloodstream. The effect was instantaneous. It was no longer a slow drift into sleep. It was a thunderclap of relief. For a patient writhing in the agony of a kidney stone or a shattered leg, the injection was nothing short of a divine intervention. One moment, there was screaming, sweating, tearing agony. The next, a warm, golden silence. The pain didn't just fade, it was obliterated. The patients looked at the doctors with tear-filled eyes, calling them angels. They called the syringe the wand of peace. But peace is often a prelude to a different kind of war, and war was coming. The mid-19th century was a time of blood and iron. The Industrial Revolution had not only mechanized the factory, it had mechanized the battlefield. The musket gave way to the rifle. The cannonball gave way to the exploding shell. The capacity to mutilate the human body had grown exponentially. In the United States, the Civil War erupted, tearing the nation apart. In Europe, the Franco-Prussian War pitted empires against one another. Imagine the scene. The field hospital at Gettysburg or Antietam. The air is thick with the smell of wet wool, old blood, and gangrene. The ground is mud, churned by the wheels of ambulances and the boots of exhausted men. Inside the tents, the scene is one of Dantean horror. Men with limbs shattered by the heavy lead mini-balls. Men with stomachs torn open by shrapnel. The surgeons, their aprons stained stiff, work by the light of kerosene lamps. They saw bone, they stitched flesh. In this cauldron of suffering, morphine was the only mercy. It flowed like water. The army doctors carried kits, filled with the white powder and the new hypodermic needles. They moved from cot to cot, dispensing the sacrament of sleep. A little morphine for the pain, son. The prick of the needle, the rush of warmth. The soldier, who moments before was begging for death to end his misery, would sink back into the pillow, a look of distant, glassy calm washing over his face. It silenced the screams. It allowed the surgeons to operate. It allowed the dying to pass with dignity. It was, in every sense of the word, a blessing. To the overwhelmed medics, it was the greatest gift science had ever bestowed upon warfare. But the war eventually ended. The cannons fell silent. The tents were struck. And the soldiers went home. They returned to the farms of Ohio, the factories of Manchester, the villages of Bavaria. They were hailed as heroes. But they brought with them a secret ghost, a shadow that followed them from the battlefield into the quiet of the bedroom. They found that they could not stop taking the medicine. The soldier's disease. It was whispered. The army disease. At first, the doctors were confused. They had operated under the assumption, a tragically naive one, that because morphine was injected directly into the blood, it bypassed the appetite of the stomach, and therefore would not cause the hunger of addiction. They thought addiction was a vice of the digestion, a gluttony of the palate. They did not understand the brain. They did not understand that the morphine molecule, shaped perfectly to fit the receptors in the human nervous system, was rewriting the very architecture of the soldier's mind. The veteran would try to stop. He would put the bottle away, but then the sickness would come. Not the pain of his old wound, but a new pain. A pain that seemed to emanate from the marrow of his bones. The sweating, the shaking, the diarrhea, the profound, crushing melancholy that made the gray sky look like a tomb. It was a physical possession. The dream god Morpheus was a jealous deity. Once he embraced you, he did not easily let go. He demanded tribute, and so, the hero of the Union, the brave soldier of the Republic, became a slave to the glass vial. He would spend his pension on the drug. He would lie to his wife. He would hide the needle in his boot. The man who had faced cannon fire without flinching now trembled if he could not find his chemist. The medical community watched in growing horror. The miracle had curdled. The pure medicine was a trap. They realized that by refining the opium, they had not tamed the tiger. They had sharpened its claws. Morphine was 10 times more potent than raw opium, and the addiction it created was a fortress that seemed impossible to breach. The narrative of the substance began to shift. It was no longer just a remedy. It was a social problem. It was a vice. But the scientific mind of the late 19th century was stubborn. It was an era of supreme confidence in progress. They did not accept defeat. If morphine was addictive, then the fault lay not in the idea of the drug, but in the specific structure of the molecule. They reasoned that they could engineer their way out of the problem. They believed that nature was a machine that could be tuned. If they could just tweak the chemical formula again, if they could add a new chain of atoms here, or remove a group there, they could create a substance that possessed all the pain-killing power of morphine, but none of the addictive curse. It was a seductive idea. The search for the non-addictive morphine became the holy grail of late 19th century pharmacology. It drove the research agendas of the great chemical companies that were rising in Germany and Switzerland. Laboratories were built, vast cathedrals of science, filled with the smell of ether and the scratching of pens. Men in white coats, the new high priests of society, bent over their microscopes. They synthesized hundreds of new compounds. They tested them on animals. They tested them on themselves. They were driven by a mix of humanitarian desire to cure the soldier's disease and the capitalist desire to patent the next wonder drug. And in this frenzy of innovation, in this desperate race to fix the mistake of morphine, they were about to make a mistake that would dwarf everything that came before. The river of time was flowing faster now, rushing toward the turn of the century. The calm, slow waters of the ancient world had become a turbulent, rapid. The science that was supposed to liberate humanity was about to shackle it with a chain of iron. In the laboratories of the Bayer Company, a new compound was being brewed. It was a modification of morphine. It was potent. It made the user feel strong, capable, even heroic. The scientists looked at the data. They looked at the calm, breathing rats. They looked at the symptom-free patients. They smiled. They thought they had finally won the game against nature. They thought they had found the cure. They did not know that they were standing on the edge of a chasm. They did not know that the cure they were about to release upon the world would make the soldier's disease look like a mild affliction. They were about to unleash a storm that would rage for the next 100 years. But for now, in the twilight of the 19th century, there was only hope. The vial was full. The needle was sharp, and the world waited, with bated breath, for the next miracle to save them from the last one. The fog of Victorian London is not merely a weather phenomenon. It is a character in the story of the 19th century. It is a living, breathing entity, a yellow-gray phantom that swallows the city whole. It is composed of the breath of a million coal fires, the soot of 10,000 factory chimneys, and the damp, ancient exhalations of the River Thames. In the year 1874, this fog lies heavy upon the cobblestones, dampening the sound of the horse hooves and the shouting of the street hawkers. It presses against the window panes of the rich and the poor alike, a constant reminder of the industrial engine that is driving the world forward, consuming the earth to fuel the furnace of progress. We move now through this murky, gaslit suspension, away from the crowded tenements of the East End and the marble halls of Westminster, to a place of quiet precision. We find ourselves standing before the imposing brick facade of St. Mary's Hospital Medical School in Paddington. It is a place of healing, yes, but also a place of inquiry. Within these walls, the air smells of carbolic acid, ether, and the faint, metallic tang of dried blood. It is here, in the secluded sanctuary of the chemistry department, that we find a man whose name has largely been erased from the popular consciousness, but whose hands unwittingly forged the keys to a century of sorrow. His name is Charles Romilly Alder Wright. To the casual observer, he is an unremarkable figure, a man of science, bespectacled, meticulous, his fingers stained with the inks and reagents of his trade. He is a founding treasurer of the Royal Institute of Chemistry, a man respected by his peers for his rigor and his dedication to the physical realities of the universe. He is not a mystic, he is a materialist. He believes in the atom, in the molecule, in the immutable laws of reaction and result. He believes that the chaos of the natural world can be tamed, categorized, and improved upon by the rational mind of man. Wright is alone in his laboratory. It is late. The gas jets hiss softly, casting a flickering, uncertain light over the rows of glass beakers, the brass microscopes, and the leather-bound journals that line the shelves. Outside, the city roars with the chaotic energy of the empire, but in here, there is only the silence of the experiment. Wright is bent over his workbench, his attention focused entirely on a small, porcelain dish. He is wrestling with a ghost. The ghost is morphine. By 1874, morphine had established itself as the undisputed king of medicine. It was the god's own medicine, the silencer of pain, the bringer of sleep. But as we have seen, the king was a tyrant. The medical community was slowly waking up to the reality of the morphine habit. They saw the soldiers returning from the wars, their bodies crying out for the needle. They saw the housewives, dependent on their daily tonic. The blessing had revealed its curse, and so, the scientific directive of the age was clear: improve the molecule. Wright's goal is not to create a recreational drug. He is not seeking to unleash a plague. He is driven by the noble, if arrogant, belief that he can outsmart nature. He believes that the addictive properties of morphine are a chemical flaw, a structural error that can be corrected in the laboratory. He theorizes that by modifying the atomic architecture of the morphine molecule, by adding a chain here, removing a cluster there, he can retain the analgesic power while discarding the habit-forming chains. He is looking for the safe morphine. He is looking for the holy grail of pharmacology. On the bench before him sit two substances. The first is the white, crystalline powder of pure morphine, extracted from the poppy, carrying with it the ancient legacy of the Sumerians and the Sleepy Hollows of the Orient. The second is a bottle of liquid, clear as water but pungent and sharp to the nose. It is acetic anhydride, a chemical reagent used in the synthesis of aspirin and other industrial compounds. It is a harsh, biting substance, a product of the modern chemical age. Wright begins his work. He measures the morphine with the delicate precision of a jeweler. He pours the acetic anhydride. He mixes them in a glass flask. There is no thunderclap, no flash of lightning. There is only the slow, steady application of heat. He places the flask over the blue flame of the Bunsen burner. The liquid begins to simmer. Visualizing the molecular dance occurring within that glass vessel requires us to shrink down to the atomic level. Imagine the morphine molecule as a complex, three-dimensional structure, a fortress of carbon, hydrogen, nitrogen, and oxygen. It is a shape that has evolved over millions of years to fit perfectly into the locks of the human nervous system. But it has vulnerabilities. It has specific hooks, hydroxyl groups, that determine how it interacts with the body. What Wright is doing, unknowingly, is armoring the fortress. As the mixture boils for hours in the dim light of the London lab, a chemical reaction known as acetylation is taking place. The acetic anhydride is attacking the morphine molecule. It is stripping away the hydrogen atoms from the hydroxyl groups and replacing them with acetyl groups. It is a double substitution. Two acetyl groups are attaching themselves to the morphine core. The result is a transformation of profound significance. The molecule is becoming more lipid-soluble. It is becoming greasier, in a chemical sense. This means that when it enters the human body, it will not just float in the bloodstream. It will rush across the blood-brain barrier with terrifying speed. It will slip through the defenses of the central nervous system like a ghost through a wall. But Wright does not know this yet. He only knows what he sees in the flask. After hours of heating, he allows the mixture to cool. He treats it, filters it, and purifies it. He watches as the new substance precipitates out of the solution. It is a solid. It forms into crystals, similar to morphine but distinct. It is diacetylmorphine. He holds the vial up to the gaslight. The crystals catch the yellow glow. They look innocent. They look like salt, or sugar, or snow. There is nothing in their appearance to suggest the devastating power they contain. This is the first time in the history of the universe that this specific arrangement of atoms has existed. Nature never created diacetylmorphine. The poppy never dreamed of it. It is a creation of man, born of fire and intellect in a room in Paddington. Wright creates several variations, boiling the morphine at different temperatures for different lengths of time. He creates a family of new compounds. He calls them tetra-acetyl-morphine, D-acetyl-codeine. He is thorough. He is methodical. He records everything in his notebook in a neat, cursive hand. But a chemist's job is not finished with synthesis. He must test his creation. He must see what this new matter does to living flesh. We can imagine the transition to the animal pens. Perhaps it is the next day, or the next week. The fog outside has not lifted. It presses against the glass. A constant gray witness. Wright prepares a solution of his new crystals. He selects a subject, likely a dog or a rabbit, the standard martyrs of Victorian science. He administers the dose. He steps back, notebook in hand, and waits. He expects, perhaps, to see a better sleep. He hopes to see the animal drift into a calm, pain-free slumber, deeper and more peaceful than that induced by morphine, but without the subsequent sickness. But that is not what happens. The reaction is visceral and disturbing. The animal does not sleep. Instead, it becomes agitated. Its breathing becomes labored. It exhibits signs of great prostration, a term Wright uses to describe a state of utter physical collapse combined with a strange, trembling fear. The drug does not seem to soothe. It seems to overwhelm. It strikes the animal's system with the force of a hammer. There's vomiting. There's a dilation of the pupils. The heart rate becomes erratic. Wright observes this with the cold detachment of his profession. But beneath the surface, there must have been a pang of disappointment. This was not the miracle he was looking for. This was not the safe morphine. It appeared to be a toxic failure. He noted that the substance induced a great lowering of power and a profound respiratory depression. To his eyes, looking for a gentle medicine, this new compound seemed dangerous, rough, and unusable. He repeats the experiments. The results are consistent. The diacetylmorphine is potent, far more potent than morphine, but its effects are brutal. It does not possess the gentle, lullaby quality he sought. It is a sledgehammer. And so, C.R. Alder Wright makes a decision that will echo through history. He decides that the substance is of no clinical value. He decides that it is a dead end. He sits at his desk, the fog swirling outside, and writes up his findings. He does not write a manifesto. He does not write a warning to the future. He simply writes a technical paper. He titles it, On the Action of Organic Acids and Their Anhydrides on the Natural Alkaloids. It is a dry, academic title for a paper that contains the recipe for the world's most addictive narcotic. He sends the paper to the Journal of the Chemical Society. It is published in 1874. It is a small entry, buried among dozens of other reports on the properties of salts and the analysis of minerals. It is read by a few hundred chemists, most of whom likely skimmed over it, and then Wright moves on. He washes his beakers, he cleans his retorts. He turns his attention to other matters, to the chemistry of soaps, to the analysis of alloys. He shelves the vial of white crystals. He shelves the idea. The silence that follows is profound. Imagine the formula sitting there, in the bound volumes of the library at St. Mary's, and in the archives of the Royal Society. It is ink on paper. It is a sleeping dragon. For 23 years, it sits there. Dust motes dance in the shafts of light that pierce the library gloom, settling on the spine of the journal. Students walk past it. Professors glance at it. But no one opens it. No one realizes what is hidden within those pages. To understand the weight of this silence, we must look at what is happening in the world outside the library during those 23 years. The world is not standing still. The late 19th century is a time of acceleration. The population of Europe and America is exploding. The cities are growing denser, taller, and louder. And with this density comes disease. Tuberculosis, consumption, is ravaging the tenements. It is a disease of the lungs, a disease of coughing, a hacking, bloody, relentless cough that keeps the sufferer awake at night and tears the lining of the throat. The doctors of the era are desperate for a cough suppressant. Morphine works, but the addiction rate is climbing terrifyingly high. Codeine is milder, but often too weak for the severe cases. They are searching, frantically, for something strong enough to stop the cough of consumption, but safe enough to give to a child. Meanwhile, the morphine habit is becoming a full-blown crisis. Sanatoriums are opening to treat the addicts. Pastors preach against the needle. The optimism of the early 1800s, the belief that opium was a harmless gift from God, has been replaced by a grim realization of slavery. And, all the while, the answer, or what they thought would be the answer, is sitting on the shelf in London. Wright's discovery is a ghost in the literature. It is a chemical curiosity with no name, only a structural formula. It is a what-if that was asked, answered, and discarded. There is a deep, tragic irony in this interlude. We often think of scientific discovery as a linear march of progress, a light bulb turning on, a sudden realization that changes the world instantly. But history is rarely so clean. History is full of pauses. It is full of missed connections. Here we have the cure for pain, the ultimate sedative, the most powerful cough suppressant ever synthesized, sitting ignored in a dusty book because one man thought it made his dogs too sick. Wright could not have known that the prostration he saw was actually the result of a massive overdose. He could not have known that if he had diluted the substance, if he had found the correct dosage, he would have seen a very different effect. He would have seen the euphoria. He would have seen the heroic feeling. But perhaps it is better that he did not. Perhaps the 23 years of silence were a mercy, a reprieve granted to humanity by fate. For nearly a quarter of a century, the genie remained in the bottle. Let us linger for a moment on the atmosphere of the late Victorian era. It is a time of duality. It is the age of Jekyll and Hyde, a story written by Robert Louis Stevenson, who was himself likely under the influence of medicinal cocaine or ergot during its writing. The culture is obsessed with the hidden self, with the monster that lurks beneath a gentleman's coat. Diacetylmorphine is the chemical embodiment of this duality. On paper, it is a triumph of rational chemistry. It is a modification of a natural product to increase its potency. It is a logical step forward, but in reality, it is a monster. It is a substance that bypasses the body's natural rate-limiting steps. It hits the brain with a rush of dopamine that is unnatural, unearned, and overwhelming. As the years tick by, 1880, 1885, 1890, the pages of the journal turn yellow. C. R. Alder Wright grows older. He eventually passes away in 1894, 3 years before his discovery would be resurrected. He dies, never knowing that he is the father of heroin. He dies thinking he was just a chemist who dabbled in morphine derivatives and found nothing of interest. The world continues to spin. The telegraph wires hum with news of wars and treaties. The electric light begins to banish the gas lamps. The automobile begins to frighten the horses. The pace of life quickens. And as life becomes faster, the desire for relief, for a way to slow down, for a way to escape the grinding gears of modernity, becomes more acute. The human nervous system has not changed in 50,000 years. It is designed for the savannah, for the hunt, for the tribe. It is not designed for the factory whistle, the crowded slum, the relentless pressure of the industrial clock. The gap between the environment we built and the biology we inhabit creates a friction. That friction is pain. It is anxiety. It is the neurasthenia or nervous exhaustion that was the fashionable diagnosis of the time. And into this gap, this friction, the opiates flowed. They were the lubricant for the industrial machine. But the lubricant was becoming a glue. The morphine addicts were clogging the system. The search for the alternative continued. It moved from London to Germany. The German chemical industry was rising to become the dominant force in the world. Companies like Merck, Hoechst, and Bayer were building vast complexes on the banks of the Rhine. They were not just pharmacies. They were factories of innovation. They had armies of chemists. They had money. They had a mandate to find the next blockbuster drug. It is here, in the shadow of the smokestacks of Elberfeld, Germany, that the ghost of Wright's discovery would eventually be summoned. But in 1874, and for the decades that followed, London held the secret. Picture the scene one last time. The quiet lab at St. Mary's. The fire in the grate has burned down to embers. The fog presses against the glass, turning the streetlights into blurry halos. The notebook lies closed on the desk. Inside it, written in ink that is slowly fading, is the formula C21H23NO5. It looks like a simple equation. Carbon, hydrogen, nitrogen, oxygen, the building blocks of life. But arranged in this specific way, they form a key. A key that fits a lock in the human brain that was never meant to be opened so wide or so quickly. The formula waits. It is patient. It has no morality, no agenda, no desire. It is simply a potentiality waiting for an actuator. It is a sleeping dragon, breathing slowly in the dark, waiting for the right prince or the right fool to come along and wake it up. Wright turns off the gas lamp. The room plunges into darkness. He walks out of the lab, buttoning his coat against the chill. He walks home through the London fog, oblivious to the fact that he leaves behind a legacy that will destroy millions of lives, topple governments, and fuel wars yet to be fought. He leaves behind the ghost, and the ghost waits. The world struggles on with morphine. The doctors prescribe it, the patients take it, the addiction spreads. They are frantic for a solution. They pray for a miracle. They do not know that the solution has already been found. They do not know that the cure is infinitely worse than the disease. They do not know that in the dusty silence of a library shelf, the seeds of a future plague are already sown, waiting for the rain of ambition to make them grow. Time flows like the Thames, dark and deep. The year 1874 fades into history. The stage is set for the next act, for the entrance of the commercial giants, who will take Wright's discarded failure and turn it into the world's most famous and infamous brand name. But for now, there is only the silence, the fog, and the sleeping molecule. The geography of history is often defined not by the shifting borders of nations or the battle lines drawn in the sand, but by the quiet, unassuming corners where the future is distilled in a glass flask. We leave the fog-choked streets of Victorian London, leaving behind the forgotten notebooks of C. Alder Wright gathering dust in the archives, and we travel across the Channel, across the rolling plains of Europe, to the industrial heartland of Germany. The year is 1897. The location is the Wupper Valley, a narrow, winding gorge where the river Wupper runs dark and sluggish, stained by the effluence of 1,000 dye works and factories. This is Elberfeld. It is a city of brick and iron, a city that breathes smoke and exhales steam, a testament to the Second Industrial Revolution. Here, the air tastes of sulfur and ambition. The sky is a perpetual bruised purple, lit from below by the blast furnaces and the gas lamps of the sprawling complexes that line the riverbanks. Among these cathedrals of industry, one name rises above the rest, a name that will become synonymous with the triumphs and tragedies of modern medicine. Bayer. In the late 19th century, Bayer was not yet the pharmaceutical colossus we know today. It began as a manufacturer of synthetic dyes, turning the coal tar of the Ruhr Valley into brilliant indigos and crimsons for the textiles of the world. But as the century waned, the alchemy of the dye vats gave way to the precision of the drug laboratory. The chemists realized that the same molecules that colored silk could also color the human experience. They realized that within the waste products of coal, there lay the potential to cure fevers, to dull pain, and to silence the body's rebellions. And so, the dye makers became drug makers, and the factory floor became a temple of synthesis. Enter the sanctuary of the Bayer Research Department. It is a pristine world, a stark contrast to the soot-stained streets outside. The walls are tiled in clinical white. The floors are scrubbed clean. The air is sharp with the scent of ether and acetic acid. Rows of Bunsen burners hum with a low, blue flame, like votive candles dedicated to the god of progress. In this temple stands a man of quiet demeanor, a chemist named Felix Hoffmann. Hoffmann is 32 years old, a man of his time, meticulous, disciplined, driven by a blend of scientific curiosity and filial duty. He is not a flamboyant showman. He is a creature of the laboratory, comfortable in the silence of the bench. He is currently riding the crest of a magnificent wave. Only 2 weeks prior, in this very room, he had achieved a breakthrough that would eventually earn him a place in the pantheon of history. Driven by his father suffering from rheumatism and the old man's inability to tolerate the bitter, stomach-churning salicylic acid then used as a treatment, Hoffman had sought a way to make the medicine gentler. He had taken salicylic acid and boiled it with acetic anhydride, creating acetyl salicylic acid. It was a triumph. It was stable, it was effective, and it was far easier on the stomach. The world would soon come to know it as aspirin. But the mind of a scientist does not rest on the pillow of past success. The momentum of discovery is a powerful narcotic in itself. Hoffman stands there, flushed with the confidence of his victory over pain, and looks for the next conquest. He wonders, if the process of acetylation could tame the harshness of salicylic acid, what else could it tame? If adding an acetyl group could turn a bitter poison into a gentle cure, could it do the same for the most problematic drug in the pharmacopoeia? He turns his gaze to the bottle of morphine sitting on the shelf. It is essential to understand the context of this moment. Europe in 1897 is a continent racking with a cough. Tuberculosis, the White Plague, is the captain of death. It stalks the tenements of Berlin, the salons of Paris, and the factories of Elberfeld. It is a slow, wasting disease that consumes the lungs, leaving the victim hollowed out, feverish, and plagued by a relentless, hacking cough that tears the throat and banishes sleep. Codeine is used, but it is weak. Morphine is used, and it works, but the cost is high. The addiction, the lethargy, the slavery that the doctors whispered about. The world is desperate for a strong, non-addictive cough suppressant. It is the holy grail of respiratory medicine. Hoffman believes he holds the map to this grail. The logic seems sound, grounded in the chemical intuition of the era. He believes that by modifying the morphine molecule, by armoring it with acetyl groups, just as he did with the aspirin, he can strip away the addictive side effects while retaining, or perhaps even enhancing, the medicinal properties. He is unaware of Alderite's failure 23 years earlier. Or perhaps he is aware, but believes his technique, his purity of reagents, or the sheer might of German engineering will yield a different result. And so, the experiment begins. It is the 10th of August, 1897, a date that should be carved in black stone. Hoffman prepares the apparatus. He measures out the morphine, the white alkaloid powder derived from the dried milk of the poppy. He pours the clear, pungent acetic anhydride. He mixes them in a glass flask. He applies the heat. The liquid swirls, a microcosm of potential energy. As the temperature rises, the chemical dance begins. The hydrogen atoms are stripped from the morphine's hydroxyl groups. The acetyl groups latch on. The molecule is transforming. It is shedding its old skin and donning a new, lipid-soluble coat. It is becoming diacetyl morphine. The reaction runs its course. Hoffman cools the flask. He treats the solution, washing it, filtering it, coaxing the solid matter to emerge from the liquid void. And there they are. The crystals form. They are beautiful in the way that deadly things often are, glittering, geometric, pure. They are not yellow or brown, like the crude extracts of the past. They are the color of crushed ice. Hoffman holds the flask to the light, the gray daylight of the Ruhr Valley, filtering through the window. He observes his creation. He tests its melting point. He analyzes its solubility. He writes in his laboratory journal, his pen scratching across the paper, recording the birth of a monster with the dry, dispassionate language of science. He has done it. He has synthesized the compound. But synthesis is only the first step. The true test lies in the biology. In the late 19th century, the protocols for drug testing were, by modern standards, terrifyingly casual. There were no double-blind studies, no ethics committees, no years of animal trials before human contact. The chemist often served as the first guinea pig, followed by the colleagues, and then the workers of the factory. It was a communal, almost tribal approach to science. The substance is prepared. It is given to the workers at Bayer. These are men who spend their days in the clamor of the factory, breathing the fumes of the dye vats, their bodies weary from the relentless pace of industrial labor. They are men who know pain, who know fatigue, who know the irritation of a smoker's cough, or the early rattle of consumption. They take the dose. And they wait. Imagine the sensation. It does not begin with the drowsiness of morphine. It begins with a flush. A sudden, expanding warmth that starts in the pit of the stomach and radiates outward to the fingertips and the toes. It is as if a heavy wool coat has been lifted from their shoulders. The pain in the joints, the ache of the shift work evaporates. The irritation in the throat vanishes, replaced by a smooth, dry silence. The cough stops. Instantly. But it is more than just the absence of pain. It is the presence of something else. A feeling washes over them, a profound and surging sense of capability. The anxiety of the day, the worry about wages, the fear of the foreman, it all dissolves into a golden, euphoric confidence. Their pupils constrict to pinpoints, but their internal vision expands. They feel taller, they feel stronger, they feel untouched by the grime and the noise of the world. The drug floods their brain with dopamine, hijacking the reward pathways with a violence that feels like a caress. They report back to the doctors and the chemists. They struggle to find the words to describe this new state. It is not just sleepy or numb. It is active. It is potent. One worker, perhaps looking for a word that captures the grandeur of the sensation, uses the German adjective heroisch, heroic. They feel heroic. They feel like the protagonist of a Wagnerian opera, invincible and bold. They feel like heroes in their own lives, lifted above the drudgery of their existence. The word catches the ear of the management. It resonates. In the boardroom of Bayer, where the men in frock coats and stiff collars gather to discuss the future of the company, this word heroisch is whispered and then spoken aloud. It is a powerful word. It evokes images of the Teutonic Knights, of Siegfried, of strength and valor. It fits the spirit of the age, an age of empires and steel. They are looking for a brand name. They cannot sell it as diacetyl morphine. That is too technical, too dry, too difficult for the apothecary to pronounce and the patient to remember. They need a name that sells the feeling. They need a name that promises salvation. And so, they take the adjective and they noun it. Heroisch becomes heroin. It is a masterstroke of branding. It is arguably the most brilliant and devastating marketing decision in the history of commerce. The name implies everything the patient wants to be: strong, brave, conquering the infirmity of the body. It suggests that the drug is not a crutch, but a weapon, a sword with which to slay the dragon of pain and tuberculosis. It feminizes the word slightly, with the in suffix, softening it, making it sound like a muse or a guardian angel. Heroin. The decision is made. The machinery of production is set into motion. The patents are filed. The glassworks are commissioned to blow thousands of small, amber bottles. The printers are ordered to create the labels, elegant, authoritative labels featuring the Bayer cross, the seal of quality and safety. The tragedy of this moment is so dense, it creates a gravitational pull on the narrative. We look back with the clairvoyance of history, and we want to scream at the men in the boardroom. We want to tell them that the heroic feeling is not a side effect of health, but the siren song of the ultimate addiction. We want to tell them that the feeling of strength is a chemical lie, a loan taken out against the soul with an interest rate of infinity. But we cannot. We can only watch as they congratulate themselves. They honestly believe they have solved the problem. The early clinical reports, biased, short-term, and blinded by the relief of the cough symptoms, suggest that heroin is not addictive, or at least less addictive than morphine. They theorize that because the dose required is smaller, due to its terrifying potency, the risk of habituation is lower. It is a fatal miscalculation. They mistake potency for safety. They mistake the silence of the symptom for the cure of the disease. Bayer launches the drug in 1898. The advertising campaign is aggressive and global. It is marketed as a sedative for coughs. It is marketed as a cure for morphine addiction, a grim irony, like using gasoline to put out a fire. It is marketed for adults, for the elderly, and, chillingly, for children. Picture the advertisements of the time. They are beautifully illustrated lithographs. A mother spooning the medicine into the mouth of a sick child. A worker stepping briskly to the factory. The text promises relief from the irritation of the throat. It promises a good night's rest. It sits on the shelf next to the aspirin. One for the headache, one for the cough. Two miracles from the same laboratory. Two children of Felix Hoffmann. One would become the most widely used and safe drug in human history. The other would become a scourge that would tear the fabric of society apart. The bottle travels. It moves down the Rhine on barges. It crosses the Atlantic on steamships. It arrives in the pharmacies of New York, London, Paris, and Shanghai. It is legal. It is respectable. It is modern science in a bottle. Doctors prescribe it with confidence. Take this, they say. It will make you feel heroic. And for a while, it does. The world enters a brief, delusional honeymoon with heroin. The sanatoriums fall silent as the patients stop coughing. The morphine addicts switch to the new drug and report that their cravings for the old poison are gone, replaced, unbeknownst to them, by a hunger for the new one that is 3 times as fierce. The heroic feeling sweeps through the population. But biology is patient. The chemistry of the brain is immutable. The liver processes the diacetylmorphine. It strips away those lipid-soluble acetyl groups that allowed it to rush into the brain. And what is left behind? What is the molecule that actually binds to the receptors once the Trojan horse has been opened? It is morphine. Hoffman had not created a new drug. He had created a delivery system. He had created a supercharged, fast-acting morphine injection system that worked through the stomach. The body turns the heroin back into the very thing it was meant to replace, but it does so with a speed and intensity that the natural plant could never achieve. The tolerance builds. The heroic feeling fades, requiring larger and larger doses to retrieve. The strength turns into a desperate fragility. The calm turns into a frantic panic when the bottle runs dry. But in 1898, the darkness has not yet fallen. The shadow is still just a sliver on the horizon. In Elberfeld, the chimneys smoke, the river runs dark, and Felix Hoffman goes home to his dinner. A quiet man who believes he has done a good day's work. He has eased his father's pain with aspirin. He has silenced the cough of Europe with heroin. He is a man of science, and he trusts in the progress of his age. The paradox of the poppy has reached its industrial zenith. From the clay fields of Sumer to the high-tech labs of Germany, the flower has been processed, refined, and packaged. It has shed its leaves and its petals. It has become a white powder in an amber bottle. It has been given a name of valor. It waits now for the 20th century. It waits for the wars, for the jazz age, for the slums and the suburbs. It waits to show the world the true meaning of the word heroic, not the feeling of the user, but the struggle required to survive the cure. The sun sets over the Bayer plant. The gas lamps flicker on. The shift changes, and in the pockets of the workers, the small bottles clink softly. A sound like the tolling of a very distant, very quiet bell. Imagine, if you will, the world as it stood at the turn of the 20th century. It is the year 1900. The great wheel of the Victorian era is completing its final revolution, and the modern age is struggling to be born. It is a time of supreme confidence. A time when the electric light was banishing the ancient shadows of the night. When the steam engine had shrunk the vastness of the globe, and when science, the new deity of the West, promised to cure the ills that had plagued humanity since the expulsion from Eden. In this atmosphere of optimism, where the impossible seemed merely difficult, we find ourselves standing on the threshold of a quiet, respectable establishment. Push open the heavy oak door. The bell above the lintel chimes softly, a delicate silver sound that announces your entry into a sanctuary of healing. This is the pharmacy of the fin de siècle. It is not the sterile, fluorescent-lit aisle of the modern drugstore. It is a place of mahogany and brass, of mysterious shadows and comforting smells. The air is thick, with the scent of camphor, crushed herbs, dried roots, and the sharp, medicinal tang of iodine and alcohol. It is a smell that promises order. It is a smell that whispers to the anxious customer that here, in this room, nature has been tamed, bottled, and labeled for their benefit. Your eyes adjust to the dim light filtering through the colored glass jars in the window jars, of cobalt blue and amber, filled with liquids that catch the afternoon sun. You scan the shelves behind the counter. They are lined with ceramic vessels with Latin names painted in gold script. Belladonna, Nux vomica, Digitalis. And there, nestled innocently, between the sticky brown bottles of castor oil and the rolls of white cotton bandages, sits a small glass vial. It is unassuming. It is modest. It does not look like a monster. It does not look like the destroyer of worlds. It is corked and sealed with wax. On the front, pasted with precision, is a colorful paper label. It bears the trusted cross of the Bayer Company, the seal of German engineering, the mark of quality that the world has come to trust. The name printed on the label is bold, projecting a sense of strength and valor. Heroin. It sits there with the legality of aspirin. It sits there with the banality of cough syrup. There are no skull and crossbones warnings, no locked cabinets, no government registers. It is simply a product, a commodity of the new century, available to anyone with a few coins and a cough. To the shopper in 1900, this bottle represents the pinnacle of pharmaceutical science. It is the answer to a prayer. It is marketed, sold, and consumed as a safe, non-addictive substitute for the dangerous opiates of the past. It is the sedative for coughs. It is the friend of the family. To understand why this bottle was greeted not with fear, but with open arms, we must understand the sound of the year 1900. If you could listen to the collective audio of that era, beneath the clatter of the horse hooves and the hiss of the steam trains, you would hear a constant, background cacophony. You would hear coughing. The world of 1900 was a world of respiratory distress. Tuberculosis, the White Plague, was the leading cause of death in the Western world. It was a slow, agonizing executioner that hollowed out the lungs, leaving the victim pale, feverish, and racked by violent, hacking spasms that could tear the lining of the throat and break the ribs. But it wasn't just consumption. There was pneumonia, bronchitis, whooping cough. There was the smog of the industrial cities, the pea soupers of London, the coal dust of Pittsburgh that coated the lungs of the population in a layer of black soot. To breathe was often a struggle. To sleep was often impossible. Into this chorus of hacking and wheezing, heroin arrived like a soft, silencing blanket. It was a miracle of timing. Bayer marketed it specifically for this purpose. The advertisements from the period are works of art, framing the drug in scenes of domestic bliss. One famous image shows a mother, calm and loving, spooning the medicine into the mouth of a sick child. The caption is reassuring. It speaks of soothing. It speaks of rest. It does not speak of the chemical binding to the mu-opioid receptors in the brainstem. It speaks of a good night's sleep. And it worked. That was the seductive, terrifying truth. It worked better than anything that had ever existed. When the sufferer took the dose, whether it was the consumptive poet in the garret or the coal miner with black lung, the effect was immediate. The physiology of the cough reflex is complex, a violent expulsion of air driven by irritation. Heroin paralyzed this reflex. It numbed the respiratory center in the brain. The tickle in the throat vanished. The chest relaxed. The violent spasms ceased, replaced by a deep, slow, rhythmic breathing. For the patient, it must have felt like a divine intervention. After months of sleepless nights, after the exhaustion of constant coughing, to suddenly be granted silence, it was a gift beyond price. It allowed the body to rest. It allowed the mind to drift. And because it was heroin, it did not just stop the cough. It brought with it that subtle, golden side effect, that heroic lift of the spirit, that warm detachment from the misery of the illness. The patient felt well. They felt cured. The medical journals of the time were filled with glowing accolades. Doctors wrote into the Lancet and the British Medical Journal, praising this new compound. They marveled at its efficiency. They noted that unlike morphine, which often caused vomiting and constipation, heroin seemed to be tolerated well. They noted that patients required very small doses to achieve relief. They praised Bayer for finally solving the riddle of the poppy. They believed the marketing. They believed that the acetylation process had indeed stripped away the addictive poison of the morphine molecule, leaving only the therapeutic medicine. It is a testament to the power of a name and the authority of a white coat. Because it was called heroin and not diacetylmorphine, and because it came from a laboratory and not an opium den, it was perceived as clean. It was modern. It was distinct from the vice of the opium eater. It was science. But the tragedy of the bottle on the shelf deepens when we consider who else it was given to. It was not just for the dying consumptive. It was for the beginning of life as well. The turn of the century was a dangerous time to be a child. Infant mortality was high. Croup, colic, and teething pain were constant companions of the nursery. A crying baby was a source of immense stress in a household, particularly in the cramped tenements of the working class, where sleep was a precious commodity needed for the next day's labor. For decades, mothers had relied on soothing syrups laced with alcohol and laudanum. But now, there was something better, something safer. Doctors prescribed heroin for children. It was recommended for the unruly infant. It was prescribed for the baby who would not sleep. Imagine the scene. The gaslight flickering in a small bedroom, the exhausted mother, the screaming child. She reaches for the bottle. She measures out a few drops of the syrup. She gives it to the baby, and the silence falls. The crying stops. The baby's eyes grow heavy and close. The breathing slows. The mother sighs with relief, grateful for the modern miracle that has brought peace to her home. She does not know that she has just administered a potent neurotoxin to a developing brain. She does not know that the peace she sees is a respiratory depression that hovers dangerously close to a coma. She does not know that the silence is artificial. She sees only the result she wanted, a sleeping child. There were warnings, faint whispers in the background, but they were drowned out by the applause of the establishment. The desire for a cure was so strong that it blinded the scientific community to the reality of the biology. They saw what they wanted to see. They saw the cough stop. They did not look closely at what was waking up behind the silence. But the darkest irony of this era, the twist of the knife that history drives into the heart of the narrative, lies in how heroin was used to treat the sins of the past. By 1900, the morphine habit was a recognized scourge. The veterans of the Civil War and the Franco-Prussian War, the morphinists of the upper class, the doctors themselves who had fallen prey to the needle, they were a visible and pity-inducing population. They were seen as slaves to a demon. The medical community was desperate for a way to liberate them, to wean them off the needle, and restore them to society. And here was heroin, the non-addictive substitute. It seems madness to us now, a logic so flawed it borders on the surreal. But at the time, it made perfect sense to the scientific mind. They believed that addiction was specific to the substance. If a man was addicted to whiskey, you gave him wine. If a man was addicted to morphine, you gave him heroin. They believed that because heroin required a smaller dose, it was lighter on the system. They believed that by switching the drug, they could break the chain of the habit. Philanthropic societies, organized by well-meaning citizens and religious groups, began to distribute heroin to morphine addicts. It was an act of charity. It was an act of mercy. They handed out the new medicine freely, believing they were handing out the key to the prison cell. Picture the morphine addict in 1905. He is shivering, anxious, his body screaming for the drug he has tried to quit a dozen times. He goes to the clinic. The doctor, a man of kindness and science, hands him the Bayer bottle. "Take this," the doctor says. "It will stop the cravings. It will help you sleep. It is the cure." The addict takes it. And, miraculously, the doctor is right. The cravings for morphine vanish. The shivering stops. The anxiety is replaced by a warm, enveloping blanket of calm. The addict feels reborn. He feels heroic. He tells his family he is cured. He tells the doctor that the demon has been cast out. He praises the name of Bayer. But what was actually happening inside the body of the cured patient? The biology of addiction is indifferent to brand names. It does not care about trademarks or chemical patents. When the heroin entered the bloodstream, it was quickly metabolized. The lipid-soluble envelope that allowed it to rush into the brain was stripped away. It bound to the exact same receptors that the morphine had bound to. It triggered the exact same release of dopamine. It satisfied the exact same hunger. The philanthropist was not extinguishing the fire. He was pouring high-octane gasoline onto the dying embers. The addict was not cured. He was upgraded. He was moved from a single-story prison to a high-security fortress. The heroin was more potent, faster acting, and more reinforcing than the morphine had ever been. The brain, sensing the flood of this superstimulant, downregulated its own chemistry even further. It built a tolerance that was thicker and harder to breach. Slowly, quietly, the cure began to dig its hooks into the patients. The honeymoon period ended. The heroic feeling began to require higher and higher doses to achieve. The coughs had stopped, yes, but a new, insatiable hunger began to wake behind the eyes of the cured. The transition from patient to addict in this era was a subtle, invisible process. It happened in the best homes. It happened to the bank manager, the school teacher, the debutante. It wasn't a sudden descent into squalor. It was a gradual narrowing of the world. At first, it was just the medicine. A spoonful before bed. Then, a spoonful before dinner. Then, a spoonful in the morning to steady the nerves. The user would notice that, without it, the world seemed sharp, gray, and hostile. A vague malaise would settle in a runny nose, a restless leg, a sense of impending doom. They would take the medicine, and the sun would come out again. They interpreted this not as addiction, but as the return of their illness. "My cough is coming back," they would say. "My nerves are bad again." And so, they took more medicine. The pharmacy shelf remained full. The Bayer factory in Elberfeld ran day and night, pumping out ton after ton of the white powder to meet the global demand. It flowed through society with the fluidity of water. It was exported to the United States, to China, to South America. It was the blockbuster drug of the Edwardian age. For over a decade, this continued. From 1898 until nearly 1910, the world lived in a state of narcotic delusion. It was a unique window in history, a time when the hardest drug known to man was consumed as casually as a cup of tea. We can look back at photographs of crowds in New York or London from this period, at the sea of bowler hats and parasols, and wonder, how many of them were walking through a dreamscape engineered by Felix Hoffmann? How many of the energetic captains of industry were fueled by the morning dose of the heroic tonic? The realization did not come as a thunderclap. It came as a slow, creeping shadow. Physicians began to notice that their patients were returning too often. They noticed that the cured morphine addicts were now displaying symptoms that looked suspiciously like the old symptoms, but sharper, more desperate. They noticed the withdrawal syndrome, a term that was beginning to crystallize in the medical lexicon. They saw the sweat, the vomiting, the agony of the bones. They saw the yen, the intense craving that turned a rational human being into a trembling wreck. Reports began to trickle into the journals, contradicting the early praise. In the United States, doctors began to report a rise in admissions to hospitals for heroinism. The word had shifted. It was no longer a descriptor of strength, it was a diagnosis of pathology. But the momentum of commerce and belief is a heavy train to stop. Bayer fought back. They defended their product. They claimed that the addiction was a result of misuse, or a moral failing of the patient, not a property of the drug. They pointed to the millions of bottles sold without incident. They pointed to the safety data. They held on to the dream of the non-addictive opiate with the desperation of a drowning man clinging to a piece of driftwood. Yet, the anecdotes piled up. The stories from the street became too loud to ignore. The wonder drug was losing its luster. The innocent bottle on the shelf, with its colorful label and its promise of sleep, began to look sinister. We must pause here to appreciate the sheer scale of this tragedy. It was not a conspiracy of evil men rubbing their hands together in a dark room. It was a tragedy of hubris. It was a tragedy of optimism. The scientists, the doctors, the philanthropists, they all believed they were doing good. They believed in the power of human ingenuity to fix the flaws of nature. They looked at the poppy, a flower that had evolved over millions of years, and thought, we can do better. They were wrong. Nature is the ultimate chemist. The poppy had spent eons perfecting its defense mechanism, its lure, its trap. The scientists had not outsmarted the plant. They had merely concentrated its power. They had distilled the essence of the trap and handed it to the world in a convenient, mass-produced package. As the first decade of the 20th century drew to a close, the golden light of the Edwardian era began to fade, obscured by the gathering storm clouds of the Great War. And parallel to this geopolitical darkening, there was a pharmaceutical darkening. The laws began to change. The free-flowing river of heroin began to be dammed by regulations. The safe medicine was about to be rebranded as a public enemy. But for the generation that had been raised on the bottle, for the colicky babies who were now children, for the coughing workers who were now dependent, the damage was done. The neural pathways had been carved. The hunger had been awakened. Imagine the pharmacy shelf one last time. The year's now 1910. The bottle is still there, but the label looks different to us now. The dust is settling. The light is changing. The innocent mother on the advertisement seems to be looking away, as if unable to meet our gaze. The silence in the shop is no longer the silence of healing. It is the silence of a held breath before a scream. The cure had become the curse, and the world, having swallowed the medicine with a smile, was about to undergo the most painful withdrawal in history. The fire had been doused with gasoline, and the spark was about to fall. The year is 1913. The world stands upon a precipice, though it does not yet know it. In the great capitals of Europe, Vienna, Berlin, Paris, London, the lights of the Belle Epoque are burning with a frantic, feverish brilliance, casting long shadows against the encroaching darkness of the 20th century. It is a time of excess, of art, of industry, and of supreme confidence. The steamships are larger than ever, the skyscrapers of New York are piercing the clouds, and the sciences have seemingly conquered the ancient mysteries of the earth. But beneath the surface of this gilded age, a silence is beginning to fall. It is not the silence of peace. It is the silence of a held breath, the heavy, suffocating stillness that precedes a storm. And nowhere is this silence more palpable, more pregnant with dread, than in the mahogany-paneled consultation rooms of the medical elite. For 15 years, the applause for the wonder drug had been deafening. The cheers had rung out from the medical journals, from the pharmaceutical conventions, from the nurseries and the sanatoriums. Heroin, the child of Bayer, the savior of the coughing masses, the non-addictive miracle, had been the toast of the new century. It had been crowned the king of remedies. But now, in 1913, the cheering crowds of the pharmaceutical world began to falter. The applause died down, replaced by a nervous murmuring, and then, a profound and chilling quiet. The confetti was being swept away, revealing the cracks in the pavement. The masquerade was ending. Reports were trickling in. At first, they were isolated anecdotes, easy to dismiss as the ravings of the weak-willed or the constitutionally inferior. A doctor in Cincinnati notes a patient who returns too frequently for his cough tonic. A pharmacist in Munich observes a trembling hand reaching for the amber bottle. But a trickle, if left unchecked, eventually becomes a flood. And by 1913, the floodwaters were rising around the foundations of the medical establishment. The letters to the editors of The Lancet and the Journal of the American Medical Association changed their tone. They no longer spoke of heroic cures and peaceful sleep. They spoke of a new and terrifying hunger. They told stories of patients who required higher and higher doses to achieve the same relief. The grandmother who once took a teaspoon for her bronchitis now consumed a bottle a day. The businessman who took it to settle his nerves now found his nerves shattered beyond repair without it. The stories were tragic in their banality. They spoke of respectable citizens, people of standing and property, who were slowly pawning the trappings of their lives, the silver pocket watches, the wedding rings, the winter coats, to buy more of the cough syrup. But it was not just the economics of the addiction that frightened the doctors. It was the biology of the withdrawal. When the bottle ran dry, when the pharmacy closed its doors, the patient did not simply return to their previous state of illness. They descended into a hell that the doctors had never seen before. The bodies of the deprived convulsed in agony. The sweat poured from their skin like rain. The bones ached, with a deep, marrow-thrumming pain that felt like being crushed in a vice. The stomach revolted. The mind, once calm and heroic, shattered into 1,000 fragments of panic and paranoia. This was not the gentle return of a cough. This was the screaming birth of a demon. The medical community, those men of science in their starched collars and frock coats, looked at the molecule again. They dusted off the old textbooks. They looked at the formula that C.R. Alder Wright had penned in London, and Felix Hoffmann had revived in Elberfeld. And with a dawning horror, the realization washed over them. They had been deceived, not by malice, perhaps, but by their own hubris and the cunning of nature. They realized what they had done. They had not created a non-addictive substitute for morphine. They had created a super-delivery system for the very addiction they had tried to escape. To understand the magnitude of this error, we must journey inward, into the microscopic rivers of the human body. We must visualize the architecture of the brain. The brain is a fortress, protected by a biological wall known as the blood-brain barrier. This barrier is a vigilant sentry, designed to keep toxins, bacteria, and large foreign molecules out of the delicate neural command center. Morphine, in its natural state, is a bulky molecule. It struggles to cross this barrier. It is like a traveler trying to walk through a swamp. It moves slowly, and only a fraction of it reaches the destination. This explains the limit of morphine's power. But heroin? Heroin was morphine in a disguise. By adding those two acetyl groups, the lipid-soluble coat we spoke of earlier, the chemists had inadvertently created a Trojan horse. The acetyl groups made the molecule dissolve in fat. Since the blood-brain barrier is essentially a layer of fat, the heroin molecule did not struggle. It did not wade through the swamp. It skated across the ice. It slipped through the wall with terrifying speed and efficiency. Once inside the fortress of the brain, the disguise was discarded. The body's enzymes stripped away the acetyl groups, and there, revealed in its naked power, was the morphine. But it was morphine delivered in a concentrated rush, a sudden deluge that flooded the receptors all at once. It was an explosion of dopamine. The rush that the addicts described, that feeling of supreme, orgasmic release, was the sensation of this sudden breach. The liver, too, played its part in the tragedy. The doctors realized that heroin broke down into morphine. Once it entered the metabolic engine of the liver, the body converted the cure back into the poison. The non-addictive substitute was simply a faster, harder-hitting version of the original sin. The irony was heavy enough to crush the spirit. They had spent decades trying to outsmart the poppy, only to build a highway that led directly to its heart. In the corporate boardrooms of Elberfeld, the mood shifted from triumph to damage control. Bayer, the giant that had risen on the wings of aspirin and heroin, was facing mounting pressure. The evidence was undeniable. The sedative for coughs was creating an army of dependents. The safe for children tonic was poisoning the youth. The brand name that had projected strength and valor was beginning to curdle into a synonym for vice. It is a rare thing in the history of capitalism for a company to voluntarily cease the production of a cash cow. But the weight of the scandal was becoming too great. The cheering had stopped. The lawsuits were beginning. And so, in 1913, Bayer made a quiet, momentous decision. They ceased the production of heroin. Imagine the factory floor on that final day. For 15 years, the machines had hummed with the rhythm of production. The glass bottles had clinked along the conveyor belts. The white powder had been weighed and packed. Now, the levers were pulled. The gears ground to a halt. The dust settled. The silence of the factory mirrored the silence of the medical community. The experiment was over. Bayer would pivot its full attention to aspirin, the good son, the dutiful child that cured headaches without stealing souls. Heroin, the prodigal son, the wild and dangerous offspring, was disowned. But you cannot unring a bell. You cannot put the genie back in the bottle once it has granted its twisted wish. Bayer may have stopped making it, but the knowledge of its power was out there. The formula was known, and more importantly, the hunger was established. Millions of people around the world had been exposed to the drug. Their brain chemistry had been altered. They did not care about corporate decisions or quarterly reports. They cared only about the silence of the blood. The cessation of production did not stop the flow, it merely changed the source. And it alerted the governments of the world that something had to be done. The era of the unregulated pharmacopoeia was drawing to a close. The Wild West of medicine, where a man could buy cocaine, opium, and arsenic at the corner store, was about to be fenced in by the iron wire of the law. We cross the Atlantic now, to the United States of America. It is 1914. The progressive era is in full swing. It is a time of moral reform, of temperance leagues smashing whiskey barrels, of muckraking journalists exposing the rot in the meatpacking plants. The American public is in a mood to cleanse itself. And in the crosshairs of this moral crusade is the drug habit. For years, the problem of addiction had been viewed through a racialized and classist lens. Opium was associated with the Chinese laborers in the West. Cocaine was associated with the African American laborers in the South. But heroin had blurred the lines. Heroin was in the white, middle-class home. It was in the suburbs. It was in the veins of the housewife and the clerk. This universality made it a terrifying threat to the social order. It was no longer a vice of the other. It was a rot from within. In the marble halls of Washington, D.C., a man named Francis Burton Harrison, a congressman from New York, drafted a piece of legislation that would change the course of history. It was known as the Harrison Narcotics Tax Act. It is important to understand the nuance of this law. The federal government of the United States in 1914 did not have the constitutional authority to outright ban a substance for medical use. That was a police power reserved for the states. So, they used the only tool they had, the tax code. The Harrison Act was, on its face, a revenue measure. It required anyone who produced, imported, manufactured, compounded, dealt in, dispensed, sold, distributed, or gave away opium or coca leaves, and their derivatives, to register with the government and pay a tax. It sounds bureaucratic. It sounds dry. It sounds like a matter of paperwork. But, in practice, it was a hammer blow. It was designed to make the traffic of drugs so cumbersome, so transparent, and so regulated that it would effectively cease for non-medical purposes. It required the use of special tax stamps. It required meticulous record-keeping. It turned the doctor and the pharmacist into deputies of the state. The act was signed into law on the 17th of December, 1914. It was meant to bring order. It was meant to curb the abuse. It was meant to return narcotics to their proper place, the hospital and the surgical theater. But laws are written on paper, and life is lived in the flesh. The immediate consequence of the Harrison Act was a seismic shock to the dependent population. Overnight, the landscape changed. The respectable medicine became a controlled substance. The bottle that had sat innocently on the pharmacy shelf between the bandages and the castor oil was removed. It was placed behind the counter, then into a locked cabinet, and finally, into the shadows. Consider the plight of the patient in 1915. Let us imagine a man, a veteran of the Spanish-American War, perhaps, or a woman who had been prescribed heroin for a difficult birth. They have been taking the drug for years. They function. They hold down jobs. They raise families. They are not criminals. They are patients. They have a physical dependence, maintained by a legal supply. Then, the law descends. The doctor, fearful of the federal agents and the tax inspectors, stops writing the prescription. "I'm sorry," he says, wiping his glasses, unable to meet the patient's eye. "The law has changed. I can no longer help you." The pharmacist shakes his head. No tax stamp. No sale. The patient is cast out. They walk out of the mahogany-paneled office and onto the pavement. The physical need does not vanish because a congressman signed a paper. The receptors in the brain do not read the tax code. The hunger remains. It grows. The yen begins to crawl beneath the skin. The panic sets in. What does a moral citizen do when their survival depends on an act that has suddenly been deemed immoral? They cross the line. The Harrison Act, in its attempt to regulate, inadvertently created a new class of criminal. It criminalized the state of addiction. The patients, now labeled addicts, did not simply stop needing the drug. They were forced to seek it elsewhere. They were forced to leave the light of the medical establishment and enter the darkness of the underworld. And nature, as it abhors a vacuum, filled the void left by the doctors. Where the pharmacist stepped back, the profiteer stepped forward. The era of medicinal innocence was over. The era of the illicit plague had begun. This was the birth of the black market. Before 1914, there was little profit in smuggling heroin because it was cheap and legal. Why buy from a criminal when you can buy from Bayer? But now, with the legal supply choked off, the price skyrocketed. The risk created value. Shadowy figures the peddlers. The pushers began to appear in the alleyways and the pool halls. They sourced the drug from stolen medical stockpiles or from illicit labs that were springing up to meet the demand. The quality dropped. The purity fluctuated. The white powder was cut with sugar, with chalk, with brick dust. The clean, sterile bottle was replaced by the folded paper bindle. The safety of the dosage was replaced by the gamble of the street. And the user changed, too. The patient slowly morphed into the junkie. This term, originally referring to those who collected scrap metal or junk to support their habit, began to enter the lexicon. The addict was no longer a victim of a medical mistake. They were seen as a deviant, a threat, a person of weak moral fiber. The empathy of the 19th century evaporated, replaced by the judgment of the 20th. The tragedy is cyclical. The society that had mass-marketed the addiction, that had advertised it on billboards and spoon-fed it to babies, now turned its back on the result. It punished the people it had hooked. It drove them into the arms of organized crime, fueling the rise of gangs and syndicates that would plague the cities for the next 100 years. As the First World War erupted in Europe, turning the fields of France into a slaughterhouse, a different kind of war was beginning on the streets of America and Europe. A war on drugs. It was a war born of good intentions, fueled by scientific misunderstanding, and codified by bureaucratic regulation. We look back at this pivotal moment, 1913, 1914, and we see the turning of the page. We see the end of the Great Binge, that strange historical anomaly where the world was high on legal narcotics. We see the closing of the pharmacy door and the opening of the prison gate. The silence that fell over the cheering crowds of 1913 was the silence of a realization coming too late. The medical community had played God. They had tried to improve upon the design of the poppy. They had tried to extract the pleasure and discard the payment. But the poppy demands its price. The poppy always wins. And so, the heroin molecule, chemically armored and stripped of its medical legitimacy, went underground. It became a ghost. It haunted the jazz clubs of the Roaring Twenties. It haunted the slums of the Depression. It haunted the veins of the jazz musicians and the beat poets. It became the ultimate symbol of rebellion and ruin. But in those early days, in the confusion of the transition, there was only the shock of the new reality. The man standing on the street corner, shaking with withdrawal, clutching a few dollars, waiting for a man he does not know to sell him a powder he cannot trust. He is the legacy of the wonder drug. He is the child of Bayer and the orphan of the Harrison Act. He is the first casualty of the modern war on addiction. The sun sets on the Edwardian age. The gaslights flicker out. The world hardens. And the river of opium, which had flowed from the Sumerian clay to the Victorian drawing room, now flows into the sewer, dark, toxic, and unstoppable. The sun set on the Edwardian age, and with it, the era of innocence was extinguished. The world that emerged from the smoke and the trenches of the Great War was a world that had lost its faith in the old gods. The Victorian certainties of order, of progress, of the benevolent authority of the state and the church had been shattered by the artillery shells of the Somme and the gas attacks of Ypres. In their place, a new, frantic energy began to pulse through the veins of the West. It was the 1920 seconds, the Roaring Twenties. A decade that has been painted in the popular imagination in colors of gold and glitter, a time of flappers dancing the Charleston, of jazz bands playing until dawn, of a civilization trying to drink and dance its way out of the memory of death. But every light casts a shadow, and as the electric neon began to flicker to life over the boulevards of New York, Paris, and Berlin, a darker narrative was unfolding in the alleyways beneath. The river of opium, which we have followed from the clay banks of the Euphrates to the mahogany shelves of the Victorian pharmacy, did not dry up. It merely went underground. It changed its course, diving beneath the surface of the law, flowing into the subterranean caverns of the illicit. Heroin, once the wonder drug of the medical establishment, the sedative for cough sold with a smile, moved into the shadows. It took off its white coat and put on the dark suit of the outlaw. To understand this transformation, we must visualize the geography of the night in the 1920 seconds. The Harrison Narcotics Tax Act of 1914 inches, the United States, and similar legislation in Europe, had built a wall around the pharmacy. The respectable door was locked, but the human desire for oblivion, that ancient hunger for the whole gill, the joy plant, remained as voracious as ever. When a river is dammed, it does not stop flowing. It finds the cracks in the stone. It seeps. It floods. And so, the distribution of heroin shifted from the clean, well-lit counter of the apothecary to the damp, dimly lit back rooms of the speakeasy and the jazz club. This was the age of prohibition in America. Alcohol was banned, and in banning it, the government had inadvertently created a vast, sprawling infrastructure of secret commerce. The speakeasy became the temple of the night. Here, behind heavy steel doors with sliding viewports, the rules of the daylight world did not apply. In the haze of cigarette smoke and the smell of bootleg gin, the social classes mingled. The debutante rubbed shoulders with the gangster, the banker drank beside the musician, and in this chaotic mixing bowl, heroin found a new home. It was no longer the drug of the grandmother treating her bronchitis. It became the drug of the avant-garde, the rebel, the artist, and the criminal. It became a symbol of the rejection of societal norms. If the society that had sent millions of young men to die in the trenches said that heroin was bad, then for the disillusioned youth of the lost generation, that was all the more reason to embrace it. It became a badge of knowing, a dark secret shared in the hushed corners of the city. We move now to the streets of New York City. It is a winter night in 1924. The steam rises from the manholes, twisting into ghostly shapes in the cold air. The elevated trains rattle overhead, a rhythmic, metallic heartbeat. In the neighborhood of Harlem, the jazz clubs are alive. The sound of the saxophone, plaintive, soulful, crying out with a human voice, drifts through the brick walls. Jazz was the soundtrack of the era, a music of improvisation, of breaking the rules, of finding beauty in the dissonance. And for many of the musicians who created this sound, heroin was the fuel. The relationship between jazz and heroin is a tragedy woven into the very fabric of American music. The musicians lived a life of relentless pressure. They played from dusk until dawn. They traveled constantly, facing the grinding reality of racism and segregation. They lived on the edge of exhaustion. Heroin offered them a way to manage the unmanageable. It was a chemical shelter. It allowed them to stand on stage, under the hot lights, and feel a cool, detached mastery. It slowed down time. It allowed the frantic pace of the bebop rhythm to feel manageable. It placed a pane of glass between the sensitive soul of the artist and the harsh, abrasive world outside. But the price of this shelter was the soul itself. The drug that gave the musician the stamina to play all night eventually took away the will to do anything else. The horn was pawned, the gigs were missed, the brilliance was dimmed. Yet, the myth persisted. The image of the cool cat, the jazzman with the heavy lids and the secret smile, became an archetype of the underground. Heroin was the dark communion of the hipster. Across the ocean, in the bohemian quarters of Paris, in Montmartre and Montparnasse, a similar scene was unfolding. Here, it was the writers, the painters, the surrealists who sought the embrace of the poppy. They were the heirs of the Romantics, of De Quincey and Baudelaire. They viewed heroin not as a medical failure, but as a tool for exploring the subconscious. They sought to derange the senses, to break through the bourgeois reality into a dreamscape of higher truth. But just like the musicians in Harlem, they found that the dreamscape quickly turned into a prison. The milk of paradise became a chain of iron. As the user changed, so did the supplier. In the days of Bayer, the supply chain was transparent. It ran from the poppy fields of Turkey to the factories of Germany, and then to the pharmacies of the world. It was regulated, taxed, and quality controlled. But, with the criminalization of the substance, the vacuum was filled by a new breed of entrepreneur. Enter the organized crime syndicates. The 1,920 seconds saw the rise of the modern gangster. Men like Arnold, Rothstein, and Lucky Luciano looked at the prohibition of alcohol and saw a fortune. But they were visionaries of vice. They looked beyond the bottle. They saw that while alcohol was bulky, hard to transport, and difficult to conceal, narcotics were the perfect commodity. A kilogram of heroin could be hidden in a false-bottomed suitcase. It was worth more than its weight in gold. And the customer base? The customer base was captive. An alcohol drinker could choose not to drink. A heroin addict could not choose not to use. The demand was inelastic. Thus began the darkening of the supply chain. The syndicates established networks that spanned the globe. They sourced the raw opium from the fields of Asia and the Middle East. They set up clandestine laboratories in Marseille and Shanghai, converting the gum into the white powder. And then they shipped it to the hungry markets of the West. But a criminal enterprise is not bound by the ethics of the apothecary. The goal was profit, not healing. And to maximize profit, one must stretch the product. This is the era where the purity of heroin began its long, tragic decline. When it left the Bayer factory in 1910, it was 100% pure diacetyl morphine. By the time it reached the street corner in 1925, it had been stepped on multiple times. The dealers at the top of the pyramid would take the pure kilo and mix it with a filler. Then they would sell it to the mid-level distributor, who would cut it again. Then, to the street peddler, who would cut it a third time. They mixed the white powder with anything that looked like it. Sugar of milk, lactose, was a common adulterant. Quinine, which mimicked the bitter taste of the drug, was another. But often, the fillers were far more dangerous. Brick dust, talcum powder, powdered glass, strychnine, The addict on the street had no way of knowing what was in the paper bindle they bought. Every dose was a game of Russian roulette. The hot shot, a dose of unexpectedly high purity or poisonous adulterants, became a common cause of death. The trusted medicine had become a dirty, unpredictable poison. And as the drug fell from grace, the language used to describe its victims shifted with it. In the Victorian era, the addict was a patient. They were an habitu. There was a degree of pity, a recognition of a medical condition. But in the Roaring '20s, as the drug moved into the alleys and the slums, a new, harsher term emerged. They were called junkies. The etymology of this word is a window into the desperation of the era. It derived from the word junk. In the poverty of the city, there were men and women who survived by scavenging. They pushed carts through the streets, collecting scrap metal, old copper wire, rags, glass bottles, anything that could be sold to the junk dealer for a few pennies. The heroin addicts, desperate for their next fix and unable to hold down regular employment, were often found in this trade. They were the ones stripping the lead piping from abandoned buildings. They were the ones sifting through the refuse of the industrial age. They were the junk men, the junkies. The term stuck. It carried with it a profound social stigma. It dehumanized the sufferer. A patient is someone you care for. A junkie is someone you throw away. It implied that the person themselves had become junk-broken, discarded, worthless. The image of the heroin user shifted from the fainting housewife on the chaise lounge to the shivering, gaunt figure in the alleyway, surrounded by rust and decay. The empathy of society evaporated, replaced by disgust and fear. Along with the change in status came a change in the ritual. In the medical days, the drug was often taken as a syrup, swallowed from a spoon, or, if injected, it was done with a clean, glass syringe by a doctor. But in the underground, the user had to become their own doctor. They had to perform the chemistry set of survival in the dim light of a tenement basement or a public restroom. The ritual of the fix became a dark liturgy. It is a scene that has been seared into the cultural consciousness, a grim parody of the religious sacrament. First, the spoon, a common household object, bent at the handle to sit level. The powder is tapped from the folded paper bindle into the bowl of the spoon. Then, the water, a few drops, drawn from a tap or a puddle. Then, the fire. A match is struck. The flame is held beneath the metal. The mixture boils. The solid dissolves into liquid. It is a tiny, alchemical transformation, a reduction of the world's pain into a few milliliters of brown fluid. Then, the cotton. A small tuft of cotton wool, perhaps torn from a cigarette filter or a clothing seam, is dropped into the liquid. It acts as a crude filter, straining out the large particles of dirt and brick dust. The needle, often old, dulled by repeated use, shared among friends, is pressed into the cotton. The plunger is drawn back. The liquid rises into the barrel. Then, the tie. A belt, a shoelace, or a rubber tube is wrapped around the upper arm. It is pulled tight, a tourniquet to trap the blood. The veins rise, blue ropes against the pale skin. The user taps the vein, coaxing it to surface. The needle pierces the skin. A flash of red blood blooms in the syringe, the register, the sign that the vein has been found. And then, the injection. This ritual, performed millions of times in the shadows of the 20th century, replaced the clinical precision of the hospital. It was desperate. It was unsanitary. It led to abscesses, to blood-borne diseases, to collapsed veins. But to the user, it was a holy rite. It was the gateway to the only peace they knew. For we must remember, amidst the grime and the crime, why they did it. We must not lose sight of the internal experience. The drug was no longer about coughing. It was no longer about physical pain. It was about the rush. The rush. It is a sensation that defies language, for language is built on shared experience. And the heroin rush is an experience of absolute, singular isolation. When the drug hits the brain, the world stops. The noise of the city, the worry about rent, the shame of the addiction, the memory of the war, it is all silenced. It is not just sleep. It is a warm, golden, oceanic feeling of safety. Users described it as being wrapped in the arms of a loving mother. They described it as a full-body orgasm that lasted for hours. They described it as the feeling of being home, even if they were sitting in a freezing alleyway. It was a profound, enveloping oblivion. It shielded the user from the harshness of reality, and reality in the 1,930 seconds was exceptionally harsh. The Roaring '20s crashed into the wall of 1,929. The stock market collapsed. The Great Depression descended like a gray blanket over the world. The factories closed. The breadlines formed. The optimism of the Jazz Age soured into the despair of the Dust Bowl. In this landscape of poverty and hopelessness, heroin found a fertile soil. For the unemployed man standing in the soup kitchen line, for the woman facing eviction, the drug offered a temporary exit. It was a chemical vacation from misery. It was a coat that kept you warm when you had no heating oil. It was a meal that filled you when you had no food. Opioids suppress the appetite. A junkie can go days without eating and not feel the hunger. In a time of starvation, heroin was a dark sustenance. The drug became a chemical shelter for the broken. It appealed to those whom society had failed. It thrived in the Hoovervilles and the shanty towns. It whispered to the hopeless that there was a place where they could feel like kings, if only for a few hours. But the shelter was a trap. The depression made the economics of addiction even more brutal. To support a habit when there were no jobs required a descent into criminality that was steeper and faster than before. The theft, the prostitution, the petty crime, it all surged. The prisons filled up. The cycle of poverty and addiction became a spinning wheel that ground human lives into dust. And as the 1,930 seconds bled into the 1,940 seconds, and the world marched toward a second, even more terrible war, heroin was there. It was in the background, a shadow army. It moved through the ports of Marseille, controlled by the Corsican mafia. It moved through the docks of New York, controlled by the Five Families. It had become an industry of immense scale, an invisible empire that ran parallel to the legitimate world. The image of the junkie was now fully formed. He was the bogeyman of the city. He was the gaunt figure in the trench coat, the nodder on the subway, the thief in the night. The medical origins were forgotten. No one looked at a junkie and thought of Felix Hoffman or the Bayer Laboratory. No one thought of the sedative for coughs. They saw only the vice. They saw only the moral failing. The transformation was complete. The substance had traveled from the temple to the pharmacy, and from the pharmacy to the gutter. It had been a god, then a medicine, and now a plague. Yet, despite the degradation, despite the brick dust and the dirty needles, the power of the molecule remained unchanged. The lock and key in the brain were the same as they had been in ancient Sumer. The poppy did not care about the social status of the user. It did not care about the laws of men. It offered its bargain to anyone willing to pay the price. The price was everything. As we look back at this era, the era of the speakeasy and the breadline, we see the foundations of the modern drug crisis being laid. We see the birth of the black market, we see the stigmatization of the addict, we see the adulteration of the supply. All the elements that define the tragedy of narcotics in the 21st century were forged in the crucible of the 1,920 seconds and 30 seconds. The music played on. The jazz grew faster, more frantic, evolving into bebop. The world hurled itself toward the atomic age, but in the quiet, dark corners of the city, the ritual continued. The match was struck, the liquid boiled, the tie was tightened, and the river of the poppy flowed into the vein, carrying the user away on a tide of dark, expensive peace. The wonder drug had become the horse, the smack, the junk. But to the man with the needle in his arm, it was still the only thing that mattered. It was the love that never left, the warmth that never cooled, the silence that never ended until, of course, the bottle ran dry. The map of the world is often drawn in ink, defined by the rigid borders of nations and the political colors of empires. But there is another map, a ghost map, drawn in the smoke of the poppy and the blood of those who harvest it. We travel now, drifting away from the cobbled streets of the Victorian West and the jazz-filled alleys of Harlem, moving eastward, across the vast expanse of the Indian Ocean, toward the rising sun. We arrive in the mid-20th century, at a place where the earth folds in upon itself, creating a landscape of jagged limestone karsts, deep, shadowed valleys, and rivers that coil like serpents through the jungle. Here, where the borders of Thailand, Laos, and Myanmar meet in a restless, tripartite embrace, lies a region of unparalleled beauty and unparalleled sorrow. The world knows it as the Golden Triangle. It is a land of mists. In the early morning, before the heat of the tropical sun burns through the canopy, the mountains are shrouded in a thick, white vapor that clings to the teak forests and the bamboo groves. It is a silence so profound, it feels prehistoric, broken only by the call of the gibbon, or the distant rush of the Mekong River, the mother of waters, flowing south from the Himalayas. But do not let the silence deceive you. Within these emerald hills, in the decades following the Second World War, a new industrial engine was roaring to life. It was not an engine of steel and steam, but an engine of agriculture and chemistry. This remote, inaccessible corner of the globe was becoming the beating heart of global opium production, a successor to the ancient fields of Mesopotamia and the trade routes of the Silk Road. To understand the rise of the Golden Triangle, one must understand the chaos of the times. The mid-20th century was a fractured era. The colonial powers, the British in Burma, the French in Indochina, were retreating, their empires crumbling under the weight of war and the rising tide of nationalism. Into this vacuum rushed the cold, ideological winds of the Cold War. The region became a chessboard for the superpowers. The CIA, the Chinese Kuomintang, the local warlords, and the communist insurgents all vied for control of these hills. And armies, as history has taught us, run on two things: ammunition and money. In these mountains, money grew on stalks. The Papaver somniferum, the sleep-bringing poppy, thrived in the cool, dry air of the high altitudes. The hill tribes, the Hmong, the Akha, the Lisu, had cultivated the plant for generations, using it as a traditional medicine to soothe the aches of hard labor and the pains of old age. To them, it was a crop, no different from maize or rice, a gift from the spirits to make life bearable. But to the warlords and the generals, it was black gold. It was a commodity that could be traded for rifles, for mortars, for loyalty. And so, the lush hills were turned into a factory. Imagine the visual. Thousands of acres of slash-and-burn fields, carved out of the jungle, planted with the delicate white and purple flowers. When the petals fell, the harvest began. The same ancient ritual we witnessed in Samaria was repeated here. The scoring of the pod, the bleeding of the white milk, the scraping of the brown resin. But, unlike the ancient world, the journey of the opium did not end in the clay jar. It was destined for a darker transformation. Hidden deep within the triple canopy of the jungle, far from the prying eyes of international observers, were the refineries. These were not the sterile, tiled laboratories of Bayer in Germany. These were bamboo huts with dirt floors, powered by diesel generators, and manned by chemists who had learned their trade in the underworlds of Hong Kong and Shanghai. The air in these clearings did not smell of flowers. It smelled of ether, of lime, of ammonium chloride, and the sharp vinegar tang of acetic anhydride. Here, the raw opium gum was boiled in great oil drums. It was mixed with water and lime to separate the morphine from the organic waste. It was filtered through flannel cloth. It was precipitated into blocks of morphine base, brownish and brick-like. For decades, this was the primary export. But as the 1,960 seconds progressed, the market demanded something stronger. The chemistry was pushed further. The morphine bricks were pulverized, mixed with acetic anhydride, and heated. The process was dangerous. The chemicals were volatile. A spark could incinerate the entire lab. But the risk was worth the reward. The result of this jungle alchemy was a substance of terrifying purity. They called it China White, technically known as No. For heroin, it was a fine, fluffy, white powder. Unlike the crude black tar or the brown heroin of the Middle East, which retained impurities and required heat to dissolve, China White was a salt diacetyl morphine hydrochloride. It was water-soluble. It was up to 99% pure. It was lighter than dust, easily transported, and incredibly potent. A matchbox full of this powder could kill a battalion, or keep a city high for a week. This white powder was the ghost of the poppy, refined to its absolute essence. It was the ultimate abstraction of the plant, stripped of all its vegetative soul, leaving only the chemical hook. And just as this new, potent product was flooding out of the refineries on the backs of mules and in the holds of riverboats, a new market arrived, right on the doorstep of the Golden Triangle, the Vietnam War. We shift our gaze now from the cool, misty mountains of Laos to the steaming, sweltering lowlands of South Vietnam. The year is 1968, or perhaps 1970. The air is heavy, wet, and thick, with the smell of burning diesel, rotting vegetation, and napalm. The noise is constant, the thwup 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 of the Huey helicopters, the crack of the M16, the distant rumble of B-52 strikes. Into this green hell poured hundreds of thousands of young American men. They were draftees, many of them teenagers, pulled from the cornfields of Iowa, the streets of Detroit, and the suburbs of California. They were dropped into a world that was alien, hostile, and incomprehensible. They were fighting an enemy they could rarely see, in a war that seemed to have no front line and no clear objective. They were terrified. They were bored. They were exhausted. They were suffering from the profound, crushing stress of a guerrilla war where death could come from a footstep on a jungle trail or a shadow in the night. And waiting for them, in the brothels of Saigon, in the villages of the Mekong Delta, and even sold by the roadside vendors, was the white powder. It was cheap, ridiculously cheap. A vial of nearly pure heroin could be bought for $2 or $3 the price of a carton of cigarettes. It was packaged in small plastic vials or sometimes in empty penicillin bottles. And because the purity was so high, often 90% or more, there was no need for the stigma of the needle. These young soldiers did not have to become junkies in the traditional sense. They did not have to tie off their arms or risk infections from dirty syringes. They could simply sprinkle the white powder into a cigarette, a method known as chasing the dragon or smoking opium joints. Or they could snort a tiny line. The absorption was instantaneous. Picture a 19-year-old soldier. He has just returned from a 2-week patrol in the bush. He has seen his friends blown apart by booby traps. He is covered in jungle rot. His boots are rotting off his feet. He is shaking with a mixture of adrenaline and trauma. He sits on a sandbag bunker, the monsoon rain hammering against the corrugated metal roof. He lights a cigarette laced with China white. He inhales. The smoke fills his lungs, and within seconds, the war stops. The humidity vanishes. The fear of the mortar attack dissolves. The grief for his fallen comrades is placed behind a thick, warm pane of glass. He is still physically present in Vietnam, but his consciousness has been transported to a place of absolute safety. He is wrapped in the warm embrace of oblivion. The heroin does not just numb the body, it numbs the soul. It creates a chemical shelter, a bunker for the mind where the horrors of the war cannot penetrate. For many, it was the only way to cope. It was not a recreational high, it was a survival mechanism. It was a way to check out of the war while still standing in it. The military command was slow to realize the scale of the problem. They were focused on the enemy in the north, not the enemy in the blood. But by 1971, it was estimated that up to 15% or even 20% of the enlisted men in Vietnam were addicted to heroin. That is, tens of thousands of men, an entire army, drifting through the fog of war, fueled by the poppy. There is a tragic duality here, a dark mirror of the ancient Sumerian use. The Sumerians used the poppy to quiet the crying child. The American soldiers used it to quiet the crying child within themselves. They were boys, lost in a man's nightmare, and the poppy offered them a mother's comfort in the form of a molecule. But the drug is a jealous mistress. It demands payment. As the war dragged on, the tolerance built. The occasional smoke became the daily necessity. The high purity of the Golden Triangle heroin meant that physical dependence set in with terrifying speed. The soldiers found that they could not function without it. They needed the morning hit just to stop the shaking, just to lace up their boots. The Army of the Republic became an army of ghosts, hollowed out by the very thing that was sustaining them. Then, the war ended. The helicopters lifted off the embassy roof. The frantic evacuation began. The politicians signed the papers in Paris, and the soldiers were told they were going home. This should have been a moment of triumph, or at least relief. The Freedom Bird, the chartered airliner that would take them back to the world, was the dream that had kept them alive. But for the addicted soldier, the return home was fraught with a new terror. They were leaving the source. They were leaving the land of the $2 vial and returning to a land where heroin was illegal, expensive, and diluted. More terrifyingly, they were bringing the war home with them, carried in their veins. The U.S. government, panicked by the reports of mass addiction, initiated Operation Golden Flow. It was a mandatory urine testing program. Soldiers were forced to provide a sample before they could board the plane home. If they tested positive, they were held back. They were sent to detoxification centers in Vietnam, hasty, grim facilities where they were forced to endure the agony of withdrawal before they were deemed clean enough to return to America. Imagine the scene. A humid detention barracks in Cam Ranh Bay, rows of cots, men writhing in the grip of the cold turkey, the sweating, the vomiting, the bone-crushing ache. It was a final indignity, a final battle fought not against the Viet Cong, but against their own biology. Many kicked the habit there, in the misery of the detox center, driven by the desperate desire to see their families. But addiction is not merely a physical state. It is a ghost that haunts the neural pathways. The soldiers returned to an America that had changed. They returned to a country divided by protest, a country that often viewed them not as heroes, but as reminders of a failed and immoral war. They returned to an economy that was beginning to stumble, and many of them returned with the ghost of the poppy still whispering in their ears. While statistics show that a remarkable number of veterans, perhaps the majority, did stop using heroin once they left the environment of Vietnam, proving that environment plays a huge role in addiction, a significant number did not. They brought the habit back to the streets of New York, to the factories of Detroit, to the suburbs of Chicago. And they were not the only things that traveled from Southeast Asia. The supply chain that had been built to feed the soldiers, the network of warlords, smugglers, and corrupt officials, did not dismantle itself when the troops left. Capital seeks markets. The river of heroin, having flooded the barracks of Vietnam, now changed course again. It flowed across the Pacific. The Golden Triangle heroin, the China White, began to appear in the urban centers of the West. It challenged the dominance of the French Connection heroin that had previously flowed through Marseille. It was purer, stronger, and more deadly. It cemented heroin's grip on the modern world. The image of the heroin user shifted again. It was no longer just the jazz musician or the alleyway junkie of the Depression. Now, it was the veteran. It was the young man next door who had gone away to serve his country and come back with a 1,000-yard stare and a secret sickness. The war in the jungle had ended, but the war on the street was just beginning. And what of the Golden Triangle itself? In the wake of the war, the region remained a lawless frontier. The warlords, men like Kunsa, the self-styled king of opium, consolidated their power. They built private armies equipped with American M16s left behind in the conflict. They turned the opium trade into a multi-billion-dollar empire. The mist-shrouded hills, once a place of quiet tribal agriculture, had been irrevocably transformed into the engine room of a global plague. We can see, in our mind's eye, the cycle continuing. The sun rises over the Mekong, the farmer scores the pod, the resin bleeds, the chemist in the jungle hut fires up the burner. The white powder is pressed into blocks. It travels by mule, by boat, by plane. It lands in a city 10,000 miles away. It dissolves in a spoon. It enters a vein. And the silence falls. The connection between the mountains of Laos and the streets of the Bronx is invisible. Yet, it is stronger than steel. It is a connection forged in the fires of the Cold War, tempered by the tragedy of Vietnam, and maintained by the unyielding chemistry of addiction. The poppy, ancient and indifferent, had conquered yet another empire. It had turned the most powerful military machine in history into a distribution network. It had proven, once again, that where there is pain, there will be a market for the cure, even if the cure is a poison. This era, the mid-20th century, was the tipping point. It was the moment when heroin ceased to be a fringe vice of the bohemian underground and became a systemic, geopolitical force. It became a commodity of war. It became a scar on the collective psyche of a generation. And as the 1,970 seconds dawned, bringing with them the gritty realism of the modern age, the ghost of the poppy stood tall, casting a long, white shadow across the future. The golden light of the Edwardian afternoon has long since faded, swallowed by the smoke of 2 world wars and the disillusionment of a century that promised progress but delivered catastrophe. We emerge now into the stark, fluorescent glare of the 1,970 seconds and the 1,980 seconds. The world has changed. The ancient rhythms of the harvest and the season have been replaced by the mechanical thrum of the city. The landscape is no longer defined by the rolling hills of the poppy fields or the misty jungles of the Golden Triangle, but by the jagged skyline of concrete and steel. The skies of the Western world have turned a bruised, industrial gray, heavy with the exhaust of millions of automobiles and the apathy of a civilization in decline. In this era of entropy, heroin ceased to be a ghost haunting the periphery. It moved to the center of the stage. It became the defining scar of the inner city, a chemical rust that corroded the iron skeleton of the metropolis. From the crumbling tenements of the South Bronx to the graffiti-stained walls of West Berlin, the image of the addict became synonymous with societal collapse. It was no longer the soldier's disease or the secret vice of the jazz musician. It was a plague of the pavement, a visible, walking symptom of a world that had lost its way. To understand the gravity of this moment, one must visualize the urban landscape of the 1,970 seconds. It was a time of urban decay, a clinical term that fails to capture the visceral reality of the rot. In New York City, landlords were burning down their own buildings for insurance money. Whole city blocks resembled the bombed-out ruins of Dresden or Warsaw, piles of brick and mortar reclaimed by weeds and stray dogs. The economy was stagnating. The optimism of the space age had evaporated. And into this vacuum, into these hollowed-out shells of buildings and lives, the heroin trade poured like a dark floodwater. The geography of the city was redrawn by the drug. There were shooting galleries, abandoned apartments with blackened windows, where the floorboards were carpeted in a layer of discarded syringes, burnt spoons, and blood-stained cotton. These were the new temples of the poppy. There were copping zones, street corners claimed by gangs, where the commerce of death was conducted in the open, under the flickering amber of broken streetlights. The drug had become the currency of the street, a darker gold standard that dictated the hierarchy of the neighborhood. In this environment, the addict, the junkie, became a distinct sociological species. The image is seared into the collective memory of the era. The gaunt figure in the oversized coat, the shuffling gait, the nodding head, the skin pallid and translucent like old parchment. They were the walking ghosts of the city. They were the visible evidence of the drug's dual nature. They sought the whole gill, the joy plant, to escape the misery of their surroundings. But the plant, in turn, consumed them, turning them into reflections of the decay they tried to flee. But the human capacity to romanticize tragedy is boundless. As the bodies piled up in the morgues of New York and London, a strange cultural phenomenon began to take root in the high towers of fashion and art. It was a grotesque mimicry of suffering. They called it heroin chic. The lens of the camera shifted from the healthy, sun-bronzed athletic ideals of the past to a new aesthetic of wasting. In the glossy pages of fashion magazines, models appeared with dark circles painted beneath their eyes. Their cheekbones were razor-sharp, their bodies emaciated, their skin the color of ash. They posed in derelict warehouses, draped in expensive silks, mimicking the posture of the withdrawal, the slump, the vacancy, the dissociation. It was a glamorization of death. It was the commodification of the junkie's agony. The cultural elite, safe in their penthouses, looked down at the street and saw an edgy authenticity in the destruction of the human form. They mistook the symptom of a slow suicide for a style statement. Musicians, too, played their part, weaving the mythology of the needle into the punk and grunge movements. The drug was portrayed as the ultimate rebellion, the final rejection of the bourgeois life. To be thin, to be pale, to be half dead was to be cool. But on the street, there was no glamour. There was no chic. There was only the grinding, repetitive machinery of addiction. The reality of the heroin user in the 1,970 seconds was a life of relentless labor, the hustle. The addict had to wake up every morning, usually in a state of early withdrawal, the dope sickness already clawing at their stomach, and find a way to generate cash. They became scavengers of the urban ecosystem. They stole car radios. They stripped copper wiring from condemned buildings. They shoplifted meat from grocery stores. It was a full-time job with no wages, only a temporary reprieve from pain. The cycle of sickness was the clock by which they lived. The drug was no longer about getting high. It was about getting straight. It was about returning to a baseline of normalcy where the bones didn't ache and the skin didn't crawl. The euphoria of the early days was a distant memory, a ghost that they chased but could never quite catch. They were trapped in a chemical prison, and the bars were made of their own biology. As the decade turned, and the 1,970 seconds bled into the 1,980 seconds, the geology of the drug supply began to shift again. For years, the Western world had been fed by the white powder of the East, the China white of the Golden Triangle, or the French Connection heroin of Marseille. This was a refined product, a salt, soluble in water, relatively clean in its chemical profile. But then, a new darkness emerged from the south. We travel now to the rugged, sun-baked mountains of the Sierra Madre Occidental in Mexico. Here, in the states of Sinaloa, Durango, and Nayarit, the poppy found a new home. The climate was perfect. The remoteness was absolute. But the chemists here were different. They did not have the sophisticated laboratories of Southeast Asia. They did not have the access to the high-grade industrial chemicals required to produce the pristine white hash-4 heroin. They were farmers. They were pragmatists. They developed a method that was crude, fast, and dirty. Instead of the multi-stage purification process that isolated the pure morphine and then carefully acetylated it, they used a rougher alchemy. They boiled the raw opium gum directly with acetic anhydride, often in oil drums over open fires. They skipped the purification steps. They did not wash the product. They did not turn it into a salt. The result was a substance that looked less like a medicine and more like a geological specimen. It was dark, ranging from a sticky, viscous brown to a hard, obsidian black. It smelled strongly of vinegar, the scent of the unreacted acetic acid. It was known as black tar. This new form flooded the western United States. It moved up the Interstate 5 corridor, carried in the door panels of sedans and the soles of boots. It appeared in Los Angeles, in San Francisco, in Portland, in Seattle, and it changed the nature of the epidemic. Black tar was cheap. It was incredibly potent, but it was also physically destructive in a way that the white powder was not. Because it was unrefined, it was full of impurities, plant waxes, fungal spores, and excess acid. When injected, it did not flow smoothly into the bloodstream. It burned. It sclerosed the veins, turning the soft, blue rivers of the arms into hard, collapsed cords. The user of black tar was forced to become a reluctant surgeon. As the veins in the arms failed, they had to seek new routes, the hands, the feet, the neck. And when the veins were gone entirely, they were forced to skin pop or muscle injecting the drug directly into the tissue. The consequences were horrific. The impurities in the tar sat in the muscle, festering. This was the era of the abscess. Emergency rooms in the American West began to fill with patients suffering from necrotizing fasciitis, flesh-eating disease. They saw botulism, a rare toxin usually associated with spoiled food, now growing in the anaerobic wounds of heroin users. They saw tetanus. They saw limbs that were swollen, red, and dying. The drug had stripped away all pretenses of being a medicine. There was no longer any connection to the sterile bottle of Bayer or the soothing syrup of the nursery. Black tar was a raw, industrial commodity of death. It looked like poison, it smelled like poison, and it acted like poison. It was the poppy in its most feral, unforgiving form. The rise of black tar and the continued prevalence of white powder in the East hollowed out entire neighborhoods. The societal impact was akin to a slow-motion war. The family unit, the bedrock of the community, fractured under the strain. Fathers disappeared into the prison system. Mothers disappeared into the needle. Children were left to navigate a world where the only role models were the dealer and the user. This was the era of mass incarceration. The state, unable to treat the root cause of the addiction, the despair, the poverty, the chemical hook, responded with the only tool it knew, the cage. The war on drugs, declared formally in the 1970 seconds, ramped up into a militarized campaign. The sound of the city became the sound of the siren. The police ram battering down the door of the crack house, or the shooting gallery, became the quintessential image of domestic policy. But you cannot arrest a molecule. You cannot handcuff a hunger. The prisons filled to bursting, becoming universities of crime, where non-violent offenders learned the darker trades of the underworld. And within the prison walls, the drug flowed just as freely as it did outside. The irony was suffocating. The very institutions designed to quarantine the addiction became incubators for it. Let us pause and consider the journey of the substance up to this point. We began with the Sumerian farmer, scoring the pod in the quiet dawn, calling it joy. We saw the Victorian doctor, spooning the syrup to the coughing child. We saw the Bayer chemist, proud of his heroic invention. And now, we see the teenager in a squat in 1980 seconds Berlin, or the mechanic in 1980 seconds Detroit, tying a belt around his arm, searching for a vein that hasn't collapsed, preparing to inject a black sludge that smells of vinegar and death. The trajectory is a descent. It is a fall from grace. The substance has not changed its fundamental nature. It is still the key to the mu-opioid receptor, but our relationship with it has curdled. It has gone from a sacrament to a medicine, from a medicine to a vice, and from a vice to a plague. In West Berlin, the situation was particularly surreal. The city was an island, a capitalist enclave surrounded by the concrete and barbed wire of the communist East. It was a pressure cooker. For the disaffected youth of the city, there was nowhere to go. They were trapped in a walled garden of gray concrete. Heroin became the escape hatch. The area around the Bahnhof Zoo, the zoo station, became notorious. It was a dystopia of child prostitution and open drug use, immortalized in the grim biography of Christian F. Here, the children of the zoo lived in the subway tunnels and the public toilets. They were the children of the economic miracle, the generation that had everything and nothing. They found in heroin a way to numb the existential dread of living on the fault line of the Cold War. They were the visible evidence that the wonder drug had become the architect of a modern nightmare. And yet, the river flowed on. The economics of the trade were too powerful to stop. The demand was inelastic. As long as there was pain, whether the pain of a broken bone, the pain of a broken heart, or the pain of a broken society, there would be a buyer for the poppy. The 1980 seconds also saw the introduction of a new terror. HIV, AIDS. The virus, silent and invisible, hitchhiked on the shared needles of the shooting galleries. The communion of the drug, the sharing of the works, became a ritual of mass suicide. The brotherhood of the needle became a death pact. The addict, already marginalized, already sick, now became the carrier of a terrifying new plague. The fear and stigma deepened. The junkie was no longer just a nuisance. They were seen as a biohazard. As the sun set on the 1980 seconds, the Western world was scarred. The inner cities were cratered. The graveyards were full of young men and women who had chased the dragon and been devoured by it. The optimism of the 20th century lay in ruins. The cough medicine of 1900 had transformed into a monster that had outlived its creators, outsmarted the laws, and colonized the darkest corners of the human experience. But the story of the poppy is a story of constant reinvention. Just as the world thought it had seen the worst, just as it thought black tar and the needle were the ultimate lows, the pharmaceutical industry was preparing to open a new door. The wheel of history was turning again. The lessons of the past, the lessons of Bayer, of the Civil War, of the Harrison Act, had been forgotten. In the laboratories of the 1990 seconds, Scientists were looking at the opium molecule once more. They were not looking to make heroin, they were looking for something better. They were looking for a pill. They were looking for a way to bring the power of the poppy back into the doctor's office, back into the respectable home, back into the mainstream. They were about to repeat the mistake of the century. They were about to rebrand the addiction. They were about to sow the seeds of the greatest opioid crisis the world has ever seen. But for now, in the twilight of the 20th century, we leave the addict in the shadows of the overpass. The needle in his arm, the black tar in his veins, the gray sky above him. He is the ghost of the poppy, standing in the ruins of the modern world, waiting for the silence that never truly comes. The wheel of history is a heavy stone, grinding slowly through the centuries, and often, in its turning, it returns to the place where it began. We have walked the long road from the clay banks of the Euphrates, where the Sumerians first scored the poppy pod, under the gaze of their silent gods. We have traveled through the smoke-filled tents of the Civil War, the gas-lit pharmacies of Victorian London, and the shadowed alleyways of the Jazz Age. We have seen the substance change its face a dozen times, from a holy sacrament to a sticky gum, from a golden syrup to a white powder, from a medicine of the battlefield to a plague of the inner city. And now, as the 20th century draws its final, ragged breath, and the new millennium dawns, the story of the poppy takes a strange, cyclic twist. It circles back to the beginning. It returns to the hands of the healers. The year is 1996. The world is poised on the edge of the digital age. The internet is waking up. The global economy is humming with a frantic, electric energy. But beneath the noise of the modem and the stock market ticker, a quieter, more ancient crisis is unfolding in the bodies of the population. Pain. Chronic, grinding, invisible pain. For decades, the medical establishment had been wary of the poppy. The lessons of the past, the soldier's disease, the addiction of the housewife, the devastation of the junkie, were carved into the institutional memory. Doctors were taught to view opioids as a nuclear option, a weapon of last resort, to be used only for the dying or the shattered. But memory is a fragile thing. It fades with time. It is eroded by the winds of profit and the genuine, desperate desire to relieve suffering. In the boardrooms of the pharmaceutical giants, a new philosophy was taking shape. They argued that the medical community had been too cruel, too stingy with the milk of the poppy. They argued that pain was not merely a symptom, but a disease in itself, a fifth vital sign that should be measured and treated with the same aggression as blood pressure or heart rate. And so, the laboratories began to hum once more. Just as Felix Hoffmann had stood in the Bayer lab in 1897, believing he could tame the morphine molecule, the chemists of the late 1992 believed they could engineer a better opioid. They believed they could separate the angel from the demon. They created a new delivery system, a small, round pill that contained a high dose of oxycodone, a semi-synthetic cousin of morphine, but released it slowly, over 12 hours. They called it OxyContin. The marketing of this pill was a masterpiece of persuasion. It was not sold in the back alleys. It was sold in the brightly lit conference rooms of luxury hotels, over steak dinners, and golf games. Sales representatives, armed with charts and graphs, told doctors that the risk of addiction was less than 1%. They claimed that the delayed absorption mechanism protected the patient from the euphoria, from the rush that led to the craving. They presented the pill as a triumph of modern science, a clean, sterile solution to the messy problem of human agony. And the doctors listened. They wanted to believe. No physician enters the profession to see their patients suffer. When a man comes to you with a back broken by years of coal mining, or a woman comes with nerves shattered by cancer, you want to help. You want to give them the peace that the poppy promises. And here was a way to do it. Sanctioned by the FDA, covered by insurance, and packaged in a safe, child-proof bottle. The floodgates opened. The prescriptions flowed like water. But they did not flow evenly. They pooled in the places where the pain was deepest, in the rusting industrial towns of the American Midwest, in the fishing villages of New England, and, most devastatingly, in the hollows of Appalachia. Let us visualize the landscape of this new epidemic. It is not the urban decay of the 1972 Bronx. It is the rolling, green hills of Kentucky and West Virginia. It is a land of hard labor and hard luck, where the coal mines have broken the bodies of generations. Here, the pill arrived not as a vice, but as a savior. It was Jesus in a bottle. It allowed the miner to stand up straight. It allowed the grandmother to hold her grandchild. It restored the dignity of function. But the chemists had made a fatal error. They had underestimated the ingenuity of the desperate. They had assumed that the time-release coating, the wax-like shell that surrounded the narcotic core, was an unbreakable seal. They did not realize that it was merely a curtain. It took no great knowledge of chemistry to defeat the mechanism. A patient, perhaps seeking faster relief, or perhaps discovering it by accident, found that if you simply crushed the pill, if you ground it into powder with the back of a spoon or a credit card, the time-release mechanism was destroyed. The 12-hour dose was released in a single second. Suddenly, the safe medicine was transformed. When snorted or injected, the powder delivered a payload of opioids that rivaled the purest heroin. The rush was there. The euphoria was there. The warm, golden embrace of oblivion was there. The genie, which had been so carefully bottled by the pharmaceutical engineers, was let loose with a single crush. The epidemic spread with the speed of a forest fire. The medicine cabinets of America became the new supply lines. Teenagers raided their parents' prescriptions. Grandmothers sold their pills to pay the electric bill. The hillbilly heroin, as it was crudely dubbed, decimated entire communities. The waiting rooms of the pill mills clinics that sprang up in strip malls in Florida and Ohio were filled from dawn until dusk. Doctors wrote prescriptions with a speed that blurred the line between medicine and dealing. Cash changed hands. The pharmacy lines wrapped around the block. For a few years, there was a strange, suspended reality. The addiction was legal. It was subsidized by health insurance. The user did not look like the junkie of the popular imagination. The user was the varsity quarterback with a shoulder injury. The user was the soccer mom with a slipped disc. The stigma was masked by the orange plastic bottle. It was a medical issue, not a drug problem. But the pendulum of history always swings back. The authorities began to notice. The death toll began to rise, not from back alley overdoses, but from respiratory failure in suburban bedrooms. The Drug Enforcement Administration tightened the net. The pill mills were raided. The doctors were arrested. The formula of the pill was changed to make it harder to crush. The prescription cliff arrived. Imagine the panic of millions of people who had become physiologically dependent on the drug. The brain, rewired by years of high-dose opioids, does not care about regulations or lawsuits. It cares only about the receptor. It demands the molecule. When the pills ran out, or when the price on the black market skyrocketed to $80 a pill, the user was faced with a terrifying choice. Endure the hell of withdrawal, the bone-crushing sickness that feels like death, or find a substitute. And there, waiting in the shadows, was the old ghost, heroin. The transition was seamless and tragic. The cartels of Mexico, sensing the shift in the market, were ready. They had watched the pill epidemic create a new army of addicts, an army that was wealthier, whiter, and more suburban than the clientele of the past. They adapted their business model. They did not wait for the users to come to the seedy parts of the city. They brought the product to them. Using a system that mimicked the efficiency of pizza delivery, young men in sedans drove into the quiet cul-de-sacs of Middle America. They carried small balloons of black tar heroin in their mouths. They met the customers in the parking lots of fast food restaurants. They offered a product that was potent, cheap, and readily available. For the price of one OxyContin pill, a user could buy enough heroin to last for days. The stigma of the needle, once a barrier, was eroded by the sheer force of the sickness. The quarterback, the lawyer, the mother, they all crossed the line. They traded the clean pharmaceutical for the dirty street drug. The cycle of 1900 repeated itself. The medicine had created the addict, and the addict turned to the poison to survive. But as the second decade of the millennium progressed, the story took a turn into darkness that no one had foreseen. The poppy, which had been the source of this joy and sorrow for 5,000 years, was about to be rendered obsolete. Agriculture is slow. The poppy requires land. It requires water. It requires sunlight. It requires a season to grow. It must be guarded from pests and police. It must be harvested by hand, bled, dried, and processed. It is a relic of the Neolithic age. In a world of instant gratification and global supply chains, the poppy was too inefficient. Enter the synthetic laboratory. In the mid-20th century, a Belgian chemist named Paul Janssen had synthesized a molecule he called fentanyl. It was a triumph of medical science, a synthetic opioid fully 50 to 100 times more potent than morphine. It was used in operating rooms for anesthesia and for the management of supreme pain in cancer patients. It was a precision tool, a scalpel made of molecules. But in the hands of the illicit chemists in the underground labs of China and Mexico, it became a weapon of mass destruction. Fentanyl represents the industrialization of addiction. It divorced the drug trade from the earth. You do not need a field in Afghanistan or a mountain in Mexico to make it. You need only a room, a set of precursor chemicals, and a knowledge of organic synthesis. You can produce millions of doses in a week. And because it is so potent, the volume required to smuggle it is minuscule. A kilogram of heroin is a brick. A kilogram of fentanyl is a nuclear bomb. It can be hidden in a devastatingly small package, an envelope, a car bumper, the lining of a suitcase. This marked the beginning of the iron law of prohibition. As enforcement increases, the potency of the prohibited substance increases. It is easier to smuggle a tiny amount of strong drug than a large amount of weak drug. Fentanyl was the ultimate fulfillment of this law. But for the user on the street, it was a ghost. The heroin supply began to change. The brown powder and the black tar were being cut with the white synthetic. At first, it was an economic decision by the dealers. Fentanyl was cheaper than heroin, so cutting it increased the profit margin. But soon, it became a chaotic contamination. Fentanyl is tasteless. It is odorless. It is invisible to the naked eye. When mixed into a bag of heroin, or pressed into a counterfeit pill designed to look like OxyContin or Xanax, it is undetectable. The user buys what they think is their familiar dose. They prepare it, they inject it or swallow it, but the margin for error has vanished. With heroin, the difference between a high and an overdose is a matter of milligrams. With fentanyl, it is a matter of micrograms the size of a few grains of salt. The illicit labs had no quality control. One bag might be weak, the next might be pure death. This was the hotshot weaponized on an industrial scale. The plague that began with a cough syrup in 1900 had transformed into a game of Russian roulette. Every time the user inserted the needle, every time they swallowed a pill bought on the street, they were pulling the trigger of a loaded gun. The experience of the overdose changed, too. The gentle sleep of the Sumerian flower, the slow drift into the dark that characterized the opium deaths of the past, was replaced by the sudden, cold stop of the synthetic. Fentanyl hits the brainstem with the force of a sledgehammer. It binds to the receptors that control breathing with such ferocity that the lungs are paralyzed almost instantly. The wooden chest phenomenon occurs. The muscles of the torso lock up. The victim does not drift away. They simply drop. They are found with the needle still in their arm, or the pill bottle still open in their hand. There is no time to call for help. There is no time to regret. The light is simply extinguished. We look now at the landscape of the modern crisis. It is a landscape of silent devastation. It is not just the junkie in the alleyway. It is the teenager found dead in their bedroom, having taken a single pill they thought was a painkiller. It is the toddler who touches a patch of powder on a park bench. It is the paramedic carrying the Narcan spray like a talisman against the dark. The tragedy is compounded by the chemical coldness of the substance. Opium and heroin, for all their destruction, had a biological warmth. They came from a living thing. They had a history, a culture, a connection to the earth. Fentanyl has none of this. It is cold. It is mathematical. It is a product of pure chemistry, devoid of soul. It offers no dreamscape, no Kubla Khan palaces of the mind. It offers only a short, sharp anesthetic oblivion, followed by a precipice. As we stand in the present day, looking back over the long, winding river of the poppy's history, we see the tragic irony of our journey. We began in the Fertile Crescent, scratching the earth to find relief from the pain of existence. We found a flower that offered a joy that was also a curse. We spent 5,000 years trying to refine that joy, to distill the medicine and discard the poison. We boiled it, fermented it, crystallized it, and synthesized it. And in our hubris, in our desperate attempt to outsmart nature and conquer pain, we created something far worse than the flower ever was. We created a synthetic death that requires no soil, no sun, and no season. The poppy fields of Afghanistan and the Golden Triangle are slowly being abandoned, not because the law won, but because the economics lost. Why wait for the flower when you can make the ghost in a beaker? The plant that walked with us out of the Neolithic age is being left behind, replaced by its own monstrous children. The cycle is complete, but it is broken. The ancient duality, the medicine and the poison, has collapsed. The medicine has become the poison. The bridge to the divine has burned down, leaving us stranded on the edge of the abyss. And yet, the human heart remains the same. The receptors in the brain are unchanged since the days of Sumer. The pain, the physical pain of the broken body, and the existential pain of the broken soul, is as real as ever. The hunger for relief, for the whole gill, endures. We are left with the image of the ghost within the ghost. The invisible killer hiding in the white powder, the empty chair at the dinner table, the silence of the bedroom. The biography of the substance is not just a history of chemistry. It is a history of our own vulnerability. It is a mirror reflecting our eternal, desperate, and often fatal desire to feel no pain. The sun sets on the modern city, casting long shadows over the pharmacies and the street corners. The story of the poppy may be ending, but the story of the addiction has entered a new, terrifying chapter. The flower sleeps, but the ghost is wide awake. We end our journey where we began, in the quiet dark. The circle closes, as all circles must. We have traveled a great distance together, traversing the vast, shifting dunes of history and the tangled, microscopic pathways of the human nervous system. We have walked the banks of the Euphrates, under the starlight of the Bronze Age. We have stood in the shadow of the pyramids. We have navigated the perilous trade routes of the Silk Road. And we have paced the sterile, tiled floors of the modern laboratory. Now, as the narrative draws to its conclusion, the noise of the centuries begins to fade. The clamor of the battles fought in the name of the poppy, the scratching of the chemist's pens, the sirens of the city streets, all of it recedes into a hush. We are left with the silence of the night. The same primordial silence that enveloped the first Neolithic farmer who dared to score the skin of the green pod. The history of heroin is not merely a chronicle of dates and chemical formulas. It is not simply a list of laws passed and wars fought. If we look closely, peering through the smoke of the opium pipe and the haze of the industrial age, we see that it is, at its core, a history of human pain. It is a biography of the desperate, eternal desire to escape the burden of being alive. For to be human is to suffer. It is to know the ache of the bone, the grief of the heart, and the existential dread of the mind. From the moment we gained consciousness, from the moment we looked up at the indifferent stars and realized our own mortality, we have sought a way to soften the sharp edges of reality. We have sought a buffer. We have sought a shield. And in the sap of the Papaver somniferum, we found it. Reflect for a moment on the continuity of this desire. The Sumerian mother, rocking her colicky child in a mud brick hut 4,000 years ago, felt the same exhaustion, the same frantic need for peace, as the Victorian housewife reaching for her laudanum, or the modern worker reaching for a pill bottle. The context changes, the clothes change, the language changes, but the nervous system remains the same. The receptors in the brain that cry out for relief are the ancient, biological constants of our species. The poppy is the key that fits this lock, a key forged by nature long before we had the words to describe it. From the clay tablets of Sumer to the glass towers of the modern pharmaceutical giants, the pattern remains unbroken. It is a cycle of hope and hubris. We seek to cheat suffering. We seek to bottle peace. We seek to synthesize heaven. We look at the chaotic, painful experience of life and we say, this can be fixed. We treat the human condition as if it were a pathology to be cured. And in doing so, we often open the gates to a hell of our own making. Consider the alchemists of every age. They wear different masks. In the ancient world, they were the priests and the shamans, chanting incantations over the boiling pot. In the Middle Ages, they were the mystics seeking the elixir of life. In the 19th century, they were the chemists, like Serturner and Wright, men of science who believed that by isolating the molecule, they could isolate the blessing from the curse. And in our own time, they are the researchers in the high-tech laboratories, manipulating the atomic structure of synthetic opioids. But the intention is always the same. It is the Promethean drive to steal fire from the gods. We want the warmth without the burn. We want the flight without the fall. We want the joy of the Hulgil without the sorrow that follows in its wake. But nature is a strict accountant. There is no debt that goes unpaid. The history of the poppy teaches us a brutal lesson in balance. For every moment of artificial peace granted by the drug, a moment of chaos is extracted in return. For every hour of heroic euphoria, there is an equal and opposite reaction of despair. The pendulum swings. The higher the peak, the deeper the valley. The cure that we chased for 5 millennia has revealed itself, time and time again, to be a trap. Yet, we must not judge the seekers too harshly. The seduction of the flower is profound. Imagine the landscape of pain that existed before modern medicine. A world without anesthesia. A world where a toothache could be a sentence of madness. Where a broken leg meant weeks of screaming agony. Where the passing of a loved one left a hole in the soul that nothing could fill. Into this world of sharp, unremitting sensation, the poppy arrived as a mercy. It was the hand of God. It was the destroyer of grief. To deny its power is to deny the reality of suffering. The tragedy lies not in the plant itself, but in our relationship with it. The poppy is innocent. It has no agenda. It has no malice. Visualize the flower one last time. Picture it blooming in the high mountains of Afghanistan, or the Golden Triangle, or the remote valleys of Mexico. It is a thing of fragile beauty. The petals are paper-thin, vibrant red, or ghostly white, fluttering in the wind. It stands tall on its hairy stalk, nodding under the weight of the seed pod. It drinks the rain and the sun. It follows the cycle of the seasons. It does not care about the empires it has shaken. It does not care about the Opium Wars, or the Harrison Act, or the rise and fall of the cartels. It is indifferent to the laws of men. It simply is. This indifference is perhaps the most haunting aspect of the story. The plant contains within its genetic code a complex chemical factory, capable of producing alkaloids that can enslave the human will. But it produced these chemicals to deter insects, to survive in a harsh environment. It did not evolve them for us. We are the ones who discovered the secret. We are the ones who decoded the chemistry. We are the ones who turned the survival mechanism of a flower into the destruction of a civilization. As we look back over the river of time, we see the debris of this collision between man and molecule. We see the soldier's disease of the Civil War, the ghostly veterans haunted by the phantom pain of their limbs and the real pain of their withdrawal. We see the opium dens of Shanghai and London, where the smoke curled around the dreams of the lost. We see the junkies of the Depression, shivering in the alleyways, stripped of their dignity. We see the young men of Vietnam, trying to check out of a war they didn't understand. We see the hollowed-out towns of the Rust Belt, where the pill mills replaced the factories. It is a tapestry of sorrow, woven with a single, white thread. But it is also a story of scientific evolution. We have watched the substance transform. We saw it start as a raw, sticky gum, organic, messy, full of the earth. We saw it refined into morphine, crystalline, pure, mathematical. We saw it acetylated into heroin, potent, fast, lipid, soluble. Hello. I'm delighted to assist you with our voice services. Choose a voice that resonates with you. And let's begin our creative audio journey together. And where does that leave us now? The poppy still blooms. The wind still blows through the fields. The chemistry sets still bubble in the secret labs, seeking the next perfect compound, the next analog that will skirt the law and trick the brain. The cycle continues. The long night of the opioid crisis is not over. It has merely changed its shape. The ghost has migrated from the flower to the beaker, but it is the same ghost. But in this darkness, there is also a strange, poignant beauty. It is the beauty of fragility. The story of heroin reminds us of how delicate the human mind truly is. We think of ourselves as masters of our domain, rational creatures ruling over the earth. But a few milligrams of a simple alkaloid can dismantle our will, rewrite our priorities, and bring us to our knees. It reminds us that we are biological machines, governed by neurotransmitters and receptors, vulnerable to the chemistry of the universe. This vulnerability should not be a source of shame, but of compassion. When we look at the addict, the figure standing on the street corner, or lying in the hospital bed, we should not see a criminal or a failure. We should see a mirror. We should see a fellow traveler who stumbled into the trap that nature laid and that science perfected. We should see the legacy of Sumer, the legacy of the Civil War, the legacy of the Sackler family, all pressing down on the shoulders of one individual. The history of the poppy is a heavy burden. It is too heavy for one person to carry. It is a collective weight, a shared history of the human species. As we prepare to leave this story, let us return to the imagery of the sleep. The poppy is, after all, the flower of sleep. Somniferum. The sleep bringer. In the ancient myths, Hypnos, the god of sleep, and Thanatos, the god of death, were brothers. The ancients understood that the line between the two is thin. The poppy walks that line. It offers the sleep that heals, and the sleep that ends. Throughout this documentary, we have explored the golden dream that the drug promises. We have seen the palaces of the mind that De Quincey built, the chemical shelter of the jazz musician, the heroic feeling of the Bayer worker. We have acknowledged the allure. To deny the beauty of the dream is to misunderstand the power of the nightmare. The dream is real. It is the payment for the soul. But real sleep, the natural, restorative sleep that you are drifting toward now, is different. It is not bought with a coin or a pill. It is not stolen from the future. It is a gift of the body, a gentle lowering of the lights. It is the peace that comes not from escaping reality, but from resting within it. So, as we close the book on the biography of the poppy, let the turbulent history fade. Let the images of the wars and the wards dissolve. Let the panic of the withdrawal and the frenzy of the rush settle into dust. Picture instead the landscape of the beginning, the fertile crescent, at dusk. The heat of the day is radiating off the clay earth. The first stars are appearing in the velvet sky. Orion, the hunter, Venus, the evening star. The river Euphrates flows slowly, a ribbon of dark silver, whispering against the reeds. The air smells of cooling dust and dry grass. In the field, the poppies are closing their petals for the night. They bow their heads. They are resting. The white milk inside the pods is still, waiting for the dawn, waiting for the harvester, who will not come for another 1,000 years. In this moment, there is no pain. There is no addiction. There is no crisis. There is only the earth, and the plant, and the silence. The echo of the first promise, the promise of the Huilgil, the joy plant still whispers in the wind. It whispers of a world without suffering. It whispers of a peace that is deep and eternal. It is a seductive whisper, one that has lured empires to their ruin. But tonight, we can listen to it without answering. We can acknowledge the promise without taking the bait. We can recognize that the desire for peace is human, but the chemical shortcut is a mirage. The true peace is found not in the bottle, but in the breath. Not in the needle, but in the night. The tragedy is written in chemistry, yes. It is a story of a cure that became a curse, but it is also a story that belongs to the past. The future is unwritten. The poppy will continue to bloom, indifferent and beautiful, but we, perhaps, can learn from the ghosts that haunt its history. We can learn to respect the power of the natural world, to acknowledge the limits of our own control, and to find compassion for those who are lost in the maze. The journey ends here. The fire of the alchemist burns down to embers. The fog of Victorian London lifts. The noise of the modern city falls away. You are safe. You are distant from the struggle. You are merely a witness to the river of time. The heavy, complex history carried within that single, simple flower is no longer yours to carry. You can set it down. You can let it drift away, like a petal falling on the surface of a dark stream, carried off into the night. Sleep now. Not the sleep of the poppy, but the sleep of the weary traveler who has returned home. The quiet dark is waiting.